All right. Welcome and welcome back to the Advances in Real-Time Rendering. Reminder, mind the slides. Actually, surprise reveal is this session is entirely plausible for recording and sharing and tweeting and go galore. So, yay. Thank the speakers, not me. So today's specials in the second part, you guys have already seen the first part. We are going to focus entirely on how to make immersive environments. We'll start with creating interactivity through wind and dealing with vegetation from God of War. We will then proceed to ocean water and some of the challenges with doing multi-resolution dynamic responsive water in the Crest ocean system. And to close, we'll talk about the atmospheric world of Red Dead Redemption, what it took to integrate an end-to-end solution for the production. Reminder, slides will be posted. Probably some of the slides will go as soon as tomorrow. Some will appear later in the week. Stay tuned, and then if you use this hashtag to talk about the course on Twitter. Again, I know I'm belaboring the point earlier in the day, and I'll probably do this some more later on, but please do fill out evaluations. Your words matter. And then submit papers to I3D 2020. Now, without further ado, we will start our first session of the afternoon, which will be presented by Sean Feely, who is a senior staff technical artist at Sony Santa Monica Studio on the team best known for the God of War series, where he focuses on advancing rendering technology and environment art workflows. Prior to joining Sony and transitioning into real-time rendering, he was a technical artist at Pixar across many disciplines: tools, UI, and workflow, stereoscopic R&D, Vista pipelines, shading, and digital restoration. Personal work includes building music visualizers, soapbox racers, emulators, and web toys. Please welcome.
Thanks, Natalia. All right, hi guys. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm just going to get right into it. Thank you so much for attending. And photography is fine, but I'll remind you that these slides are actually already up on our studio site, and they'll be up later, as Natalia said. And I'll show references again at the end, so don't stress or block anybody's view to get a photo. Again, I'm Sean Feely, a senior staff environment tech artist at Sony Santa Monica Studio. If you join our team and you want rosy cheeks in your studio portrait, just spend all weekend at the beach before your first day like I did. God of War is my first game in the games industry, which is just crazy to me. It's been quite a ride. For about 8 years prior, as Natalia said, I worked in film and animation at Pixar. So if I over-explain some obvious game development thing, or it's probably just something I learned in my transition. But if I under-explain something and you have some questions or comments, go ahead and fire away at the Real Big Feel on Twitter. So I hope you want to learn about an interactive wind system in God of War, because that's what we're going to talk about a lot today. We're going to go deep enough into this that you could go home and start implementing something like it. But in case you're just getting into tech art or computer graphics, I've tried to make this widely accessible as possible. Basically simple enough that my mom could understand it. She did not. So let's jump in. This talk has several chapters. We're going to go over our goals for the system, wind sim, wind motors, wind receivers, data and shader implementation, tricks we learned along the way, and some extra goodies like new approaches for vegetation levels of detail and interactions. Basically, each of these chapters tries to answer a simple question. Why are we doing this? Where is the wind? What makes it? What reacts to it? How does that all work? And how can we be better? And after doing all of this work, how can we reuse it to get further value? First, let's get our bearings and talk about the current state of the art. In a basic wind system, you have a wind direction and speed. Maybe it changes if you maintain state and accumulate texture movement. You have a noise texture or a procedural function that scrolls with the wind. And then you move mesh vertices as the noise scrolls past. And that's it, you're done. You've got yourself a working wind system. Go ahead and ship it. Now, this is what most games seem to use today, and when we were in development, it's a simplified version of the technique from Crisis described in GPU Gems 3. And if it does everything that you want it to, it's really all that you need. But I personally have been excited to see some recent games pushing for more. Red Dead 2 certainly did some things that have humbled me as a tech artist. And in this talk, we're going to revisit this basic system a few times as a foundational point of reference, and then extend its concepts. So here's that simple wind system in one of our wind test scenes. It looks fine, it's certainly shippable. But for me, at least, it's lacking a certain level of interactivity and dynamism. Okay, so what did we set out to do, and why did we do it? And what could a richer system get us? Our player is powerful. How can we extend that to the environment? Well, we've got 3 goals for the shaping of our wind. The player should be able to observe if their actions affected wind, and it probably should. They're playing as a powerful god. The player should be able to observe which way the wind is blowing, but at the same time, the player should also be able to observe spatial variety of speed or direction. Now, a reminder that able to observe and must observe are differing goals. We aimed for subtlety in an effort to avoid being distracting. I think that if we can't achieve these 3 goals in most conditions, the complexity increase of our system isn't really worth it. And when developing our assets and workflows, we need to respect those goals plus a few more. At a bare minimum, we can do better than if there's wind, just wiggle. Let's not just improve functionality, but aim for better results even in conditions that don't require a fully dynamic system. An isolated model should look good when wind is blowing across it for all wind speeds, and a group of models should look good together when wind is blowing across them together. In other words, neighboring models should appear cohesive in their behavior. Now, that's a lot of constraints, so given our fantasy setting and style, we didn't constrain ourselves to realistic behavior, but believable behavior. And I gotta admit that last one I kind of made up for this presentation, but it definitely reflects my mindset during development. This was never supposed to be PBR for wind. I like to think that what we shipped achieves these goals, so let's jump back into our test level and see what it adds. So we can generate environmental effects, like the wind from that fan. Player attacks can affect their surroundings. And you can throw the axe at or near anything and watch those things react as it goes by. So let's get into how we built it. First, we need a place for the wind description to live. We are going to use what we already know as a launchpad and modify it to achieve our established goals. With that simple system, we have a single wind vector for the environment. And everything uses that value, so the wind is the same everywhere, no matter where we are interested. We need wind to vary in space and time. Alone, this could be procedurally modeled with a bunch of noise, and if you can afford it, more layers of noise almost always looks better. But to highlight local effects and player actions, we need a bit more control. We do this by storing and updating lots of wind values within a volume of space. Now here's an in-game close-up of player attacks generating wind within this volume. Here, wind strength is in XYZ, visualized as RGB, and viewed as horizontal slices of the volume texture. You could theoretically use any kind of fluid simulation to update each frame, 2D or 3D. For our game, it's a simple advection diffusion simulation in 3D. You render in the wind vectors, you blur them, and then you sample backwards to advance the wind forwards. Now, my co-developer, Rupert Renard, has given presentations on our wind system implementation for simulation. And this reveals just how much I'm lying when I say that it's simple, but he made it simple for me. If you're interested in a purely technical deep dive of our fluid sim, you could check out the slides at this URL, which is case sensitive, or you can find them on the stories section of the Santa Monica studio site. Rupert was a great collaborator and made it easy for me to treat the sim volume as just a black box that just works. So some details about that. Our wind simulation volume covers a pretty large area. Its footprint is 32 by 32 meters, and it's 16 meters tall. You can see Kratos there in the center for scale reference. Our 3D texture is at a 1 meter resolution. We're not limited to cube voxels for our implementation, but we tried testing with flattened or tall voxels, and it didn't really yield any strong winds for our use cases. To get more out of our interactive area, we center it at a point in front of the camera. We still need to simulate something behind the player though, so we only push forward about 25%. To be clear, we do this looking on the vertical axis too, so the portion of interactive volume on screen is something like 24 to 24 to 12 meters. The goal in tuning these numbers is feature resolution and covering the distances that the player can throw the axe, whether it's as far or as high as possible. So now that we have a wind system that lets us control wind across space and time, how do we actually manipulate it? How do we make something like that fan? Our basic wind primitive is called a wind motor, and there are a couple different behaviors. We have 3 basic shapes: spheres, cylinders, and cones. A cone is just a cylinder with one of its radii set to 0. We can animate these shapes' strengths, positions, orientations, and scales, and the wind output is rendered into the simulation volume. So what is their output? Within those shapes, we have three simple distributions. Directional motors emit wind along the primary axis. Omni-motors emit wind outwards from the central point. And vortex motors emit wind around the primary axis. We also have a special fourth type of wind motor, the wake motor. This outputs wind in the direction that it travels, proportional to its speed. I'm going to pause here for a second. These arrows are showing the pure direction of travel. What we found works better, actually, is to have the direction fan out a little bit. So we combine the direction away from the motor's center, and we do this with equal weight before scaling by speed. This gives us a sort of pine cone shape for the wake motor. And here's that output in motion. This will be a little clearer in a moment with an in-game example using the full simulation. And I'll mention one last thing. We use a 2-frame average for the motion input. This gives us a little bit more outward angle on tight curved paths like an axe swing. Now, you might not need this averaging, and honestly, we might not need it either. It wasn't entirely intentional. Late in the project, we found we were doing this accidentally by computing the distance between the current frame's position and the previous frame's previous position. So I fixed the bug, and it looked better before because we tuned everything, and I undid the fix and renamed the variables. Game of the year. So let's take a look at some in-game examples. We get a lot of mileage out of those wake motors. It's easily our most used wind primitive. We put them in the effects that spawn on weapons, so we get a free ride from the animations that the animators have authored. We also create libraries of motors with animations to spawn, like this large burst instance. This is short, so we'll watch it twice. And here's a better look at that fan from our test level. Now, we didn't use directional motors as much as I thought we would. I expected, for example, the dragon boss fight to use it a lot, but that battle was in a dead, rocky area and there was nothing to blow around, so no need to do work no one will see. Okay, I love this special attack. This is a textbook vortex motor. Our effects guys are awesome. And as the player levels up their gear, we can increase the wind strength of their attacks. It's a subtle effect, but you can feel it. And here's my best windy attack combo with late game items and total isolation. You can see how lots of moving wake motors can begin to craft any of the other primitive shapes based on what the animation is doing. You can also take a huge directional motor, larger than the volume itself, to shape wind for your level. At least that's what we thought we could do, and that was our initial approach. E3 2016 used it, but there's a problem with it. It tends to produce uneven results. When you look in the direction the wind is going, it's very, very strong. But when you look back to where it's coming from, it's weak to non-existent. Tuning this is a series of painful compromises, and it just doesn't seem to work. So in that example, you may have noticed in the simulation debug view that there's a gradient that matches the behavior that we saw. And why do we see this gradient? Well, the fluid is accelerating just as expected, but there's nothing outside the box to push in from the edges, so wind is slower on that side. And this is something that we needed to fix. So far, we've been trying to use a simulation to replace the simple wind system that I described in the intro. But we can solve this gradient issue by using the simple system to define our ambient wind baseline. And we use this instead of comically large motors. This lets wind exist outside the box, and it keeps the dynamic system nice and tidy. Plus, we can use it to add an extra layer of noise at the system level, creating localized pockets of gust and calm. And here's that same scene with the level wind authored using the ambient wind component of our system. With ambient wind handling the large, far-reaching wind features, combined with the dynamic wind handling the closer, interactive wind features, we have a full and rich description of the movement of air within our game world. So now we know where the wind is, but what reacts to it? Wind receivers are what react to it, and there are 4 receiver types that respond to wind, and these are in order right now of how excited I am to talk to you about them. Audio. This will be quick because I don't know what I'm talking about. Sometimes audio wants to know the wind speed. And we use a custom WWise attribute so they can use this value to mix. But this is a graphics conference, so let's move on. Cloth, not really thrilled to talk about this because it didn't work for us, but I'll tell you what we tried. Each cloth object sampled the wind system once at its transform center, and that force is applied to each simulation point on the mesh. That force is applied, that is then scaled down by the dot product of the force direction and cloth normal, and this is intended to give us a variety of motion as cloth rotates and flaps. And as always, we scroll some noise. So why didn't this ship? Well, we overhauled a lot of things for the new God of War, you may have noticed. And we have to make a lot of compromises. I think we made a lot of the right ones, but the cloth system is one component that didn't really get an upgrade. Adding wind to it exposed a lot of problems, and we'd like to revisit the wind on cloth in the future and the cloth system as a whole going forward. But that was a lower priority for this game because we found ways around it. We're still able to have cloth moving in game. Some of those are non-interactive pre-simmed elements. These are mostly in cinematics. Or on objects that serve a design function, like this boat dock flag. You want this to be visible even in calm settings. And we're also able to get some interactivity by skipping the cloth system completely and using mesh receivers. I'll talk about those shortly. These objects don't collide with the world, but they do respond to wind and therefore to player action. So moving on to particles. Each particle samples the wind speed and direction at its location. Artists control how much the particle reacts to this information. Conceptually, particles respond in the same way that they do to drag, but within a moving fluid. So a slow or stationary particle will speed up to match the fluid around it, while a fast-moving particle will slow down. Each frame, we compute the impulse each particle would need to match the wind speed, and we apply that, scaled by the particle's wind influence value. The wind speed that it targets is the full combination of both the ambient and dynamic wind values, and this showed a lot of promise in tests early on. This was a really exciting test. It's a pretty old one, before we moved particles to the GPU and before the sun grew any hair. And there's a lot of interesting movement driven by interactions. But I have to be honest, everything in this is tuned precisely to look good for this scene, and there was no level wind present. We still ship this functionality, but the wind motors and settings that we used on axe attacks and in the levels, they struck a balance that for particles, it works, but it's missing some of that excitement of the first particle test scene. Now, this is not a knock on the effects team. They were very engaged and enthusiastic towards getting everything that they could out of the system. But if the effect looks better without responding to wind, I have to agree, ignoring that force is the right decision. On the tech art side, we had oversimplified and lost some crucial control, and this was my mistake. So what do I wish that I'd done differently? How can we improve this going forward? Well, there's two things that I'd like to explore. First, I think that if we had separated the controls for the ambient wind and the dynamic wind influences, we could have let particle systems ignore the level wind and only respond to the dynamic effects. Now, this seems like a hack and a bad idea, which is why we didn't do it at the time. But in practice, effects artists tend to bake in some ambient scale shaping anyway, and level wind isn't always finalized before effects work is done. Also, strong ambient wind speeds, they sometimes tended to push particles off screen before they could even fade in. Artists were wondering where my particles went. Second, our particle system was already using noise fields before wind was added, so the wind isn't adding any noise to them. The thinking was that we could keep these components isolated, but I think that blending between different turbulence settings for calm and windy scenarios could prevent some of the scrolling particles look that we shipped under strong wind conditions. Okay, moving on to meshes. A lot of refinement went into this one. It's used widely across the game: characters, props, faked cloth. And there are 5 components to this system, 2 of which are new for dynamic wind. So how do those 5 components relate to each other? Well, art authors 2 of them for each asset: the per vertex data, defining which parts of the model move and which parts don't. Tools can help with this. And model parameters, which describe how the moving parts behave. It's a good idea to build a library of these settings. These are both used by the vertex shader on the text side, and this is all that you need for a static wind system. For dynamics, we add state for each model instance, and the vertex shader uses this. And we have a compute shader that grabs those states each frame and updates them. This mostly involves scrolling noise and smoothing the raw wind signal. Some of the model parameters are also used to update this behavior. Now we're going to go over each of these. We'll start with the vertex data. We use 4 floats to store 2 data values. The first float is for the wind mask. This attenuates the movement due to wind, and it's usually a gradient from 0 to 1, representing the normalized distance to the root vertices, the verts that don't move. The other 3 floats store the relative location of that root vertex. That's shown here with XYZ as RGB. We store this as a delta rather than an absolute position. This allows for translation of the art without recomputing the colors, and it means smaller numbers, which can help with precision. Next, we'll look at the object level parameters. Now, there are 3 categories of these. We have leaf parameters, which control model shaping and posing, settling parameters, which directly control some broader movements over multiple frames, and tree parameters. For models that activate these tree controls, we get a second hierarchy level to our shaping, centered at the object root, so we don't need additional vertex data or skinning support from character tech art. Now, this is a lot of control, and it can be a bit overwhelming. So we took care to make these defaults good, and a new model should only have to change 2 or 3 of these, if any, but learning which ones is still a challenge for the artists. Building up a library of these settings so that artists can use a similar model's values as a starting point has been very helpful. Now let's go over how each of these behave within the vertex shader. Movement scale is the total distance that the freest verts can move from their rest position. Higher values means more movement, and we scale this value by the wind mask. Verts move by the average of the wind vector and the noise vector. The wind vector gives us the lean, and the noise vector gives us the wiggle. Density controls the scale of these noise features. We actually allow this parameter to have 2 values, one for low speeds and one for high speeds. We blend between these settings as wind speeds increase up to about 20 to 30 meters per second. But most models use the same value for both, but some models really benefit from having those separate controls. Bend controls how straight the elements are when they lean. A higher value isolates movement to just the tips. This is implemented as the exponent that we raise the wind mask to. It's basically a gamma ramp on that grayscale wind mask. For example, a value of 1 will give a straight piece when leaning, and a value of 2 will give us a parabolic bend. We get our movement by translating vertices. We don't rotate them like I've seen some other games do. This avoids slow trigonometric functions in the shader, but it can introduce some stretching, so we need to do something to preserve lengths. And we do this by checking the distance to the root before movement and scaling back towards or away from the root to match that length. This helps prevent ground penetration, and it gives us the appearance of a resisted rotation under extreme forces. We don't have to scale all the way back, though. We can use linear interpolation to correct the stretching by just a fractional amount. And this is what our stretchiness parameter controls. So some stretch usually looks a bit better than a full rigid correction. Our default is a 20% stretch. Now, I goofed on this slide with the pattern, and I flipped the low and high, but the labels are correct. Moving on to stiffness, we can create the appearance of stiff elements by scaling the vertex texture coordinates down towards the element root. This is just like adjusting the noise density, but it keeps the effect centered on the root of the element. Stiffer values can give low variation across an individual element, and high values give variation between different elements. So with sway, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. We have 2 sway parameters that adjust spring properties of the object. These are stateful, so the computation is done once in the compute shader, and the result is passed to the vertex shader. When I said earlier that we lean verts by the wind vector, I lied. It started out that way, but what we actually do is we lean verts by a sway vector, which is pushed around by the wind vector and pulled back to center by a spring force. The strength of that spring is this sway spring parameter. The other sway parameter controls the dampening of that spring, which affects the settling time of the model. Okay, back to the vertex shader. If we activate tree mode, we get an extra layer of motion. Trees pivot around the object root, and we do an additional stretch fix for the tree movements just like we do for leaf movements. Trees have an additional bend parameter. It behaves in the same way that the leaf bend parameter does. It's a power function on the normalized distance, a gamma curve. The straight trunk here makes it easy to see the difference between a 1.0 linear bend and the 3.0 cubic bend on the right. Tree movement scale is just like leaf movement scale. It's the distance that tip vertices can move due to tree lean at the highest wind speeds. And lastly, tree leaf lag. This is interesting. Without it on the left, you can see that when the tree settles, the leaves return straight to their rest pose as well. But we can add a delayed secondary motion for free by using that sway momentum as though it's the sway position for the leaves. We already have this computed for our dampened springs. Now, using momentum in this way works because it's the derivative of the position. And since the derivative of a sinusoidal motion is the same curve delayed by a quarter phase, we can just lerp to it to dial in a bit of delay. We only do this when wind speed is decreasing because that's when the branches are the one leading the motion. Okay, now it's time to get noisy. What is our noise function? Our noise is a three-dimensional texture computed at game startup filled with random XYZ vectors that are bound within the unit sphere. You can use any noise base you like, and the techniques we're about to discuss should still apply. So we extend that base function by using fractal noise. Fractal noise is usually a weighted sum of multiple noise samples at various scales. These scaled samples are called octaves. The most common method is to reduce the scale by a power of 2 for each octave. And since the features are scaled down, we scale down their contribution weights as well. Here's a crude visualization of the contribution curve. It's an exponential fall off in this case. This combination of noise gives us, gives us a rich signal with features at a wide range of scales. Wrong pipe. Now, usually scaling a noise is pretty straightforward. We just scale the input coordinates. But there's a problem with that if the scale is animated, and ours is because we blend scales based on the wind speed. On the left, a naive scaling causes noise features to move, and this effect is worse the farther you are from the scale center. We do not want this unintended motion. On the right is our solution. We lock samples to powers of 2 using a technique called logarithmic binning, and we blend and fade between them to produce our complete noise result. Put another way, instead of scaling the samples and keeping their contributions fixed, we keep the scales fixed and we adjust their contributions. So let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. Here we're viewing the continuum of all noise octaves that have a power of 2 scale. Let's say the artist chooses a density scale of 1.3. Here, the nearest power of 2 is 1.0 in this case. And it's going to be the noise scale with the most significant contribution. Instead of an exponential fall-off, we use a triangular fall-off centered at the input scale. We use 4 octaves for our fractal noise, weighted by that triangle. After applying those weights and summing the samples, we get our final result. Animated scales will smoothly fade octaves in and out to generate fractal noise that does not move. A bonus to using these fixed logarithmic scales is that neighboring models with similar but not equal scales will still share some noise features that can scroll across them both. So those are some of the ways that we've tried to improve the look of individual objects. Next, we're going to look at how we can improve the visual cohesion of multiple objects. For that, we will focus on how the compute shader moves noise around. To make some of these subtleties more easily identifiable for this discussion, I'm going to demo with some outrageous settings. Like some really outrageous settings. We're zoomed out a bit here. You can see Kratos in the center. He's that dot. Wind is blowing in a steady direction at a steady speed here. So each object has a world space coordinate. That's where its center is located in the world. But it also has a texture space coordinate, where its center is located in the texture. To create the effect of noise moving across the object, we offset its texture coordinates. We do this in the opposite direction that wind is traveling. We do this because if you track the circle with your eyes, you'll see that the noise features inside it appear to move down and to the left relative to the circle's center. Each object that receives wind keeps track of its texture offset, and the compute shader moves this coordinate each frame based on the wind speed and direction that object is experiencing. So this works great for coherent wind, where wind is the same speed and direction everywhere. It also looks great for more complex weather patterns, until it doesn't. Only works for a short time. Slowly, things seem to get more and more random until the notion of directionality is lost. And when we switch back to a more uniform wind pattern, we don't really recover from this damage. So we need to look at why this could be. Well, let's take a look at 2 neighboring objects. They're neighbors in world space and they're neighbors in texture space. Where they overlap, they share some noise features, and they continue to share these features even as they move through the texture together. But if their directions differ, they spread apart in the texture. They're still neighbors in the world, though. This creates a disconnect. It's distorting the noise texture between them. They share features at first, but they become more isolated as time passes. The same problem occurs for objects at different speeds. One solution to this could be to just reset their texture position periodically. And this already exists. We've basically rediscovered flow maps. We use them all the time on surface materials and sky domes. This Vista flow was done by the amazing Timo Pilahamaki, one of our environment art leads on the project. You can see more of this kind of stuff on our team's ArtStation drop. The basic gist is this: at some rate, rewind to fix your texture distortion. Unfortunately, that naive approach would cause pops, but you can fix that by doing it twice, half out of phase. Fade back and forth between these two samples, and you can hide the pop by resetting the sample that is fully faded out. Now we're going to build on this. From now on, I'm going to refer to this reset as the flow flip event. So let's try that in 3D by tracking 2 texture coordinates for each object, sampling the texture with both of them, and fading between those samples so we can reset one coordinate at the flow flip event. You can see we no longer have distortion accumulating, and we can recover. But there's also a pretty noticeable loop. Loop, 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 loop. If you didn't see it before, you definitely do now. And we can improve this. So our white noise texture, because it's white noise, has the same spectral properties everywhere. So we don't need to reset the coordinate to their starting value. We can go anywhere we like. We still need neighbors to stay neighbors, though. So this randomization is computed once on the flow flip frame and shared with all objects. Back to that looping fade. Loop, loop, loop. In a moment, we'll randomize the global offset whenever we flip flow. And there it is. You can see the loop has gone away, which helps the fade from being noticeable. In a way, this is almost creating a 4-dimensional noise texture, but with only 3 dimensions of data. So let's look at all of this under that hurricane wind shape. At this speed, it looks pretty good for our flip rate to be about half of a second. But when we slow down the wind, it's weird. The flip rate here is too fast. All of the motion we're seeing here is coming from the blend, not from the scroll. At this speed, it's slower for a single texture voxel to scroll by than it is for the texture to fade between each other. So we can increase the time it takes before we flip. Now we're at about 5 seconds, and it's working pretty well. If we test this again at a faster speed with that time, we're really just back to where we started. We need a better solution for this. Adjusting the timing doesn't seem to be working for variable speeds. So we needed to rethink this. What does the flow map technique try to achieve in the first place? Well, we author some rate and time for the effect to loop, but is time really our core concept? For example, how do we know when to adjust it? Well, we tweak it when there's too little movement or too much distortion. So that's what we should try to tune for. That's the parameter we should expose, maximum distortion. And we can define that as the distance traveled in texture space since the last flow flip event. Now there's a problem here. If neighbors are drifting apart because of speed, their flip timings will drift apart too. It's kind of like when your car's windshield wipers are in sync with the car in front of you until they're not. So we need a way to bundle similar speeds together and schedule their flip to happen on the same frame. If only we knew of some way to group numbers together across all scales. Hey, do you guys remember logarithmic binning? I sure hope so, because it was like 5 minutes ago, guys. We will only consider the flow flip rate for wind speeds that are exactly a power of 2. For every other wind speed, we will make their behaviors identical to the nearest power of 2's behavior. Fast speeds will reset more often, and you can see that speeds in the same bin, like in this example, 0.8 and 1.3, they will flow flip at exactly the same time and rate. So they both flip now, and they both flip now. What's nice about the power of 2 logarithmic binning is that the neighboring bins will flow flip exactly twice or half as often. This means that for half of their flips, they're perfectly in sync. This is important for speeds that are close to each other, but not close to the powers of 2 themselves, like 0.7 and 0.8 here. You can see they both flip now, and now just 0.8 flips. Now they both flip. and now just one of them does. So if the wind speeds are varied, but mostly unchanging, all objects will stay in their same speed group. But that's pretty rare. If an object's wind speed changes, it may find itself closer to a different power of 2, and therefore out of sync with its new group. To correct for this, we adjust our fade rate for that object so that it will be in sync with its group by the time the flow flip occurs. Objects that are behind schedule, like the one on the left, will briefly speed up, and those that are ahead of schedule, like the one on the right, will briefly slow down. Now there is an exception to this. If an object enters a group that is about to flip, but it itself is very behind schedule, we identify this as the group having completed more than 75% of its phase, while the object has completed less than 25% of its own. For these, we target the next flow flip time. Essentially, it's running late for the bus, so we just tell it to catch the next one. This prevents sudden rapid fades, which are perceived as animation pops. So with all that put together, now our noise features stay consistent for coherent flows, and they stay consistent for divergent flows. They work across all speeds, whether it's slow or fast, and any accumulated distortion recovers gracefully. And here's an old development clip that may give you an idea of what that flow flip rate looks like for that hurricane shape of wind. These objects are hacked to bounce at their flip rate. You can see the faster flip rate of objects on the perimeter and the slower rate of those in the center, where there are lower wind speeds. You can also see at the group boundaries that members of adjacent logarithmic bins will flip at exactly half or double the rate of their neighbors. And you may also notice that they are in phase with each other, so they can reset on the same frames. So that's our wind system. Up next is the grab bag section of the talk. What tricks have we learned over a full development cycle with this system? Artist education. As artists and managers and producers come to understand this system and its limitations, we can borrow on some existing intuitions by using lighting analogies. The wind volume, for example, is kind of like our shadow cascades. If your motor is not in the box, it's not going to blow wind. Just like if a model is outside of a shadow map, it won't cast any shadows. Wind motors are kind of like point and spotlights. They inject light and wind into the scene in a targeted way. Ambient wind nodes are kind of like directional or ambient lights. It doesn't matter where you put them, they're going to affect everything all the same. Also be careful not to leave stray ones laying around in C files. Wind receivers are to the wind system what materials are to the lighting system. The system tells you how much is coming in, and the model and material properties describe how the model will respond to that. So we've landed on a workflow for altering vertex data that works really well for 90% of models. We choose the meshes that we want to run, we tag the vertices that we want to anchor, and our vertex color tool will compute the wind mask as the normalized distance from the closest connected root. We normalize separately for each connected piece across the entire model. Artists can merge unconnected pieces just for this computation, so if there's some floating elements they want to combine, they can do that. And sometimes we don't even need to manually select the root vertices. We can guess them for each piece. Implicit roots can be the vertex with the largest or smallest component along the X, Y, Z, or U and V texture axes for the connected piece. Or they could be the closest vertex to a specified surface or point in space. We can also mix implicit and explicit roots. If the implicit guess is good for 9 out of 10 pieces, the artist can just tag the roots on the piece that needs correction and run again. Travis Slagle is a senior tools tech artist at our studio, and he did an amazing job taking this workflow I described and creating a tool that realized it. So for a long time, I got the same question over and over again. Hey, Sean, what's a good wind speed for authoring my model? And my unhelpful answer was all of them. We need to look good at all speeds. So to get everyone on the same page, we were inspired by something that Rupert had discovered, the Beaufort scale. This was developed by sailors in the early 19th century, and it describes 12 distinct categories of wind speeds and the land and sea behaviors that identify them. It's a great reference, and if you're interested, you should check it out on Wikipedia. Now, 12 is a bit more granularity than we need, So we reduced to 5 agreeable named speeds. We would use these to direct wind intensity in levels and keep models looking like they exist in the same space. Our speed categories are still, this is my favorite video on the slides, calm, breezy, strong, and violent. Because it wouldn't be a God of War game without a little bit of violence. So we added these named buttons to our wind speed override tool, and that way everyone can test their models under the same conditions and sanity check level settings. Just click the named button and it pushes the slider to the respective value. After establishing this language, the wind speed questions disappeared. And these are our speeds for each of those, but the numbers don't really matter here because it's technically just the texture scroll speed, not the speed of the wind it's supposed to look like. Again, this is not PBR wind. Okay, here's the weird tip of the day. When you're tuning model parameters and testing under different speeds, go ahead and blow on your screen. Try and match the energy of the wind speed name. Calm, breezy, violent, and then maybe wipe your screen afterwards. It's a dumb idea. You'll feel silly, but everyone can get in on the fun, and I promise you it works. Once the model feels like it's responding to you, it just kind of clicks. Go ahead and check it in. You've got some good settings. So some trees in our game are very large, and they wouldn't really sway too much. We found that we got a better look by putting wind on the branches individually and activating the tree behavior on those branches. This meant that each one could sample the wind separately, and this was important because an axe throw would make the whole tree shake if they had shared a single sample. And here's a look at one of those branches with 3 different settings. On the top, we have no tree settings. Vertex paint is just a gradient from the branch root to the leaf tips. On the bottom, we tuned with tree settings activated. The model on the left is using that same gradient as the one on top, while the one on the right is using a gradient that radiates away from the branch core. The bottom right model is the one that we shipped after I fixed that one wiggly vert. And when modeling branches to use this extra layer of tree movement, it's helpful to align your vertices with the branch's flow and the texture. After all, if there's no vertex there, you can't pin it as a pivot. Using these verts creates this radiant gradient from the branch core, which in motion looks a little less rubbery than this linear gradient. But sometimes I like to blend the mask of both while keeping the pivots from the one on the left. And here are those kinds of gradients in motion on a model. We can see the different plausible looks that we can get from just playing with how we generate vertex colors. The left one is that radiant one, on the right is the linear gradient, and the middle is a blend of the two. For this model, I believe we shipped the blend, but the left settings look pretty good to me as well. So leaning further into, if it's stupid but it works, it's not that stupid, hanging banners and ropes are just upside down trees. We stubbed in a setting for pendulum movements specifically for this purpose, but we didn't complete the functionality because springs looked fine, and you always have all the time in the world at the end of a game, right? For hairs, especially for flyaways, it works well to have the pivot of each hair vertex use the closest point on the scalp as its root. To be clear, this is different from the workflow we've been describing. The pivot is not a vertex on the hair mesh itself. We set the vertex wind mask to the distance between the vert and the scalp. Then we normalize the mask for the entire hair mesh. In this video, the left model uses this technique, and the right model uses the hair origin as a pivot, while the middle is a blend of the two. For this character, we ship the one on the left. Fur can be a bit tricky. It's usually made of a single quad cards or triangles. And this means that the bend parameter does nothing because both 1 and 0 don't change no matter what exponent you raise them to, unless it's 0. Fur is usually laying flat against the skin, which means that it's easy for even small movements to cause penetration, and we don't have bend to mitigate that. For these, we compute pivots with the usual method, but we set the wind mask value for the tips to be the distance to the skin, just like we do for hair. And we renormalize for the whole fur mesh, not for each individual card. Before normalizing, we take that maximum value, and we use about 90% of that on our model's wind movement parameter. A reminder, if you do this, to go ahead and set bend to 1.0 for these, otherwise you'll mute the effect on short hairs since we're baking in their absolute lengths. Beards are a lot like fur. In our game, we have more spans to work with. At least our models do, and I'm glad that they did, because it lets us use bend, and we can go pretty high on the exponent. Kratos' beard, for example, uses 3.0. The fur on his pelt, on his back, had multiple spans, and it uses 3.3. These high values keep the interior of the beard stiff, but it lets the tips convey motion. And to let the beards shape the silhouette on the far cheek side, it's okay to use large enough movement values that just the tips will penetrate into the side of the face that's getting hit by wind. It's possible it could poke into the mouth interior, but we never saw this happening. And some of our bearded characters have beard shells underneath the cards, while some don't. For wind, if you're making decisions based on that, my preference is for the shells to be rigid and fairly tight to the skin to prevent them from becoming exposed as cards move around, or just no shells at all. Okay, so for the rest of the talk, we're going to cover some adjacent vegetation work that we did. For some of our vegetation levels of detail and shadow proxies, we use an imposter grade solution that works well with wind. And this technique is known as billboard clouds. What's the first thing that you think of when you hear that name? Is it fluffy, textured quads that face the camera? Yeah, me too. Everybody does. But that's not what this is. These are essentially billboard clouds. We started calling them card clusters, and the confusion disappeared. I suggest the industry do the same, but it's really up to you guys. Now, this technique is more advanced than just a couple world axis aligned cards. We referenced 2 papers in our implementation. Now, this approach builds on the state of the art of the mid-1990s by asking 2 questions. What if we used more cards, and what if those were the best cards? For volume-filling geometry, like leafy vegetation, the results are pretty good. One of these is the source mesh. Can you guess which one? How about now? There's definitely a quality versus performance sweet spot. Try not to get carried away. So for an input model, we're going to make a cluster of cards, one at a time, starting with the best one. How do we find that? It's easy. Just test for all card planes in the known universe. Give a score to each one. High score wins. A potential card considers a thick slice of the model. It will flatten model triangles that are close to the card plane within some error metric. The other triangles will be left for other cards. Cards are scored by how much of the model they are able to capture and how little those triangles distort. Mathematically, this is defined as the sum of their areas after projecting to the plane. That's the world-spaced area times the dot product of the triangle and plane normals. Or you can think of it as the total card texture coverage by those flattened tris. So the best card claims its faces. This is a greedy algorithm. We repeat the process on the remaining portion of the model until nothing is left. So that's a lot of computation. How can this be faster? Well, the space of all cards is something like the 6-dimensional planoptic function, but how can we reduce that to 2 dimensions? We reduce that to 2 dimensions, the direction of the card faces, and how far it is from the center of the object. All other planes are redundant. We can space the candidate planes out, and this spacing interval can be proportional to the error metric. So if you're okay with more distortion, you can compute fewer card candidates. For directions, we used normals of a geodesic sphere. And we only need half of this sphere since negative directions are redundant, and it's easy to subdivide if we want more candidates. The geodesic distribution also prevents oversampling at the poles. A Fibonacci spiral could work well too, but I like the symmetry of the geodesic sphere. The projected area of each face also doesn't change if the plane orientation doesn't change, so we can pre-compute individual face areas for each orientation batch. And of course, we can just ignore cards that are far away. They have to intersect the model bounding box. As you would with imposters, we render the material channels from orthographic cameras. For each card, we match the camera position, orientation, and bounds to the card and its contents. This can include the clipping planes. The distance between near and far can match the closest parameter, the error metric. We use the Python image library and Maya UV auto layout to generate our final textures. And lastly, Sometimes a face is close to a card that scored highly, but it's not a good pair for that card. It's a victim of the greedy algorithm. After we know the cards that we will use, it's fast to retest all the faces to see if they would score better with a different close card. If we find a better card, we switch it over before rendering textures. This helps prevent a large gap appearing around the first card that we find, and it preserves the visual density of the model better than compensating by rendering faces into multiple cards. In our test level here, we're looking at card cluster versions of these trees, and as we approach, they'll fade into full models. For shadow proxies here, we are always using the card cluster version, even at this close range. We use card clusters instead of imposters so that we get wind movement and parallax. This is done with a vertex attribute transfer from the base model to the card cluster model. It's not an exact match, but it gives us some good movement, especially in the shadows. Now, as the card cluster models get further away, we were noticing some matte edge inconsistencies or inaccuracies. So we needed to flood our textures. This is often done by dilating or blurring an image and putting the original on top, repeating over and over until you've flooded enough. Now this looks nice, but players are never going to see that beauty. It's slow, especially for large images, and it biases a bit towards the edge color. It's probably not noticeable except in contrived situations, but it could be a bit better. I wanted something a bit faster, so I developed what I call MIP flooding, which assumes power of two sized images. For an image, we start with using an unpremultiplied color. We scale the image down to half of its size, weighting the samples by their alpha coverage. And we repeat until we get to 1 pixel wide or tall. I suggest using floating point for this for precision. We remember these textures, and then we walk back up the MIP chain, using nearest neighbor to upscale. We composite the higher res MIP on top of the lower res, and we repeat all the way back up the stack. This is fast to generate, and it scales well with image size because of the logarithmic component to the algorithmic time complexity. And on disk, this will compress better because of those large areas of constant color. You could also use this for fast, smooth hole filling if you use bilinear sampling in the up-res chain. But just a note that the results differ depending on grid alignment, so I wouldn't use it for video that's panning. Lastly, I came here today to chew bubblegum and kick grass. And bubblegum is beyond the scope of this presentation. So let's talk about ground vegetation interaction. How does it move when physical objects collide with it? Physical objects like characters, just chilling in the grass, we want their presence to affect nearby vegetation by moving it out of the way. This is commonly done with a top-down projected render texture. Each collider can render into this texture a simple representation of itself, like a sprite of some directional vectors, rendered with an additive blend so that multiple shapes can mix in any order. A vegetation model that wants to respond to collision would read this world space texture and move its verts in the direction sampled. Andrew Maximov did this for Uncharted 4. Another method is to render collider shapes into a height field instead of explicit directions. To blend these in any order, a minimum blend mode preserves the deepest disturbance. This could push verts down proportional to the displacement and use the stretching fix that we described earlier to make it look like rotation. Or you could compute the gradient of the field and use that to push away from the collider. Now, of course, this is not the Photoshop gradient, this is the calculus gradient. It's the direction of greatest slope. So if we whip up something simple, you can see here the grass is parting near the character's feet. It looks pretty good with this camera, but this is not our game's camera. This is our game's camera. You'll rarely see his feet, which means you'll rarely see this movement. And that's disappointing, or at least it was to me. We needed something more. My goal was to figure out a way to extend this settling so that the player could see a trail. Our first pass at the trail was to use 2 channels for XZ direction offsets and extend it with an extra channel for effect age. We use a ribbon particle system to create some trail geometry. This extends the trailing edge of the sphere and fades out all channels over its lifespan. The extra age channel, shown here in the blue channel, would let us seek into a procedural settling animation. This technique showed promise, and we used it for E3 2017, but it had some problems. It could only use sphere colliders. Multiple colliders could Z-fight in the render texture so that grass between a troll's 2 feet might pop back and forth. And also, since it was a top-down projection, it would move vegetation no matter the height of the effect. And this meant that elevated colliders like leaping wolves, lifted objects, or tall, high-stepping trolls, they would look like a ghost was moving through the grass beneath them. So maybe we could use our footstep system to splat fading sprites into the render texture. After all, this would only happen when feet touch the ground. This could work, but it would also greatly increase the authoring burden on our effects team, who already had a lot scheduled. This would require a lot of extra tagging of materials and animations in our pipeline. Because of this extra workload, I suggested we not pursue this approach. My gut told me that there was a better solution out there. And it only took about 7 months of thinking about it in the background before I proved my gut right and landing on a solution that would meet the visual target and fit into the performance and memory budget. We use approximate shapes, like rag dolls, and we render the height of their bottom side into 2 channels. One channel is held every frame, and the other fades upwards. How much that channel faded can tell us how much time has passed since the collision was rendered. And when verts lean out of the way, we use the slope of the unfading height field to determine the direction and magnitude of the lean. Here's another video with a more detailed player collider. You can see his feet shuffling around there. This render texture is double buffered, so we can construct accurate motion vectors for our vertex movements. And that's true for all the techniques we described in the past. We use read, modify, write to blend the minimum into the fading channel. And we replace the unfading channel only if that blend pushed the height field down. Except I couldn't use read, modify, write. It's slower and was not in my budget. But we can take advantage of the double buffering to read from the previous frame, letting us do the compositing in the render texture pixel shader. Now this does mean that in some rare cases, draw orders could lead to a negative height difference for one frame, but we just fix this in the vegetation vertex shader by clamping to 0, and that way we don't have negative timings. Lastly, this works best for stationary or high movement colliders. An idling player animation can sometimes cause vegetation to pop a lot from its settling animation back into its trampled pose. We mitigate this by reducing the fade rate to 0 where the player is standing, which is always at the center of the texture. This slows the settling animation to 0 under their feet. Here's some work in progress testbed video showing how that works. You can see how, as I got further and further down this rabbit hole, I started using more and more debug visualization just to keep myself sane. So visuals will help us understand this a bit better. On the left here, we're going to look at the dual height field texture. And on the right, we'll see the world view from its side. First, we'll render a sphere. In the world view, I'm adding a slice of the height field so that we can see it in space. Okay, let's go ahead and take away that sphere. You can see that one channel of the height field fades up at a constant rate, while the other one is held firmly in place. We add the sphere back. Now let's move it and pause. The differences in the height field channels divided by the fade rate can tell us how much time has passed since the collider moved away from that position. We use a procedural animation for the total lean. It's just a cosine times a fall off. And it goes negative to give us overshooting as vegetation settles. We use the time passed to seek a pose from that animation curve. And as the sphere continues to move around, you can see how it overwrites the held channel only when it's deeper than the faded channel. This means shallower collisions need to wait for the vegetation to settle somewhat before they can affect it, but deeper collisions can affect it right away. Let's watch that one more time, but this time with some simple grass geometry reacting to it. One last look at the ship technique in action. For smaller characters, like that poor guy there, we use simple mesh spheres as collider shapes. Now I'm going to turn the spheres off on Draugr so you can see the effect on them better. For our larger and hero characters, we try to get more faithful collision representations by attaching shapes to multiple joints. And we're not limited to primitive shapes. The troll totem here has a custom collider shape, for example, and it works pretty well. You can also see the importance here of separate foot colliders for larger characters. And lastly, the boat is another case where we use the custom mesh collider. Okay, that was a lot to go over. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope everything was clear and you were able to take something away from it, even if you don't plan to implement a system with all of these features. We don't have time for questions immediately, but if you have some, I'll hang out around afterwards, or you can reach out to me on Twitter, The Real Big Feel. And I have to say, thank you to Natalia for organizing this. When I was in the film industry, I always enjoyed learning about what's going on in games, and it really helped my transition. And if you'll indulge me, I have to shout out some coworkers, because I really could not have built this without the teamwork of some amazing people. I mentioned Rupert Renard. Again, he was one of our graphics programmers and was instrumental in co-developing this system with me. Florian Strauss, our technical director for the project, developed the snow system that I was able to borrow a lot of tooling from when building the ground vegetation collisions. Paolo Saricchio, one of our graphics programmers responsible for effects and rendering, did a great job integrating and evolving the wind influence in our particle workflows to my specifications. Travis Slagle, a tools tech artist, built a tool that we use for 90% of vertex authoring of the data on our wind meshes. And Max Ankar, our effects lead for the project, he set up wind on the vast majority of attacks and was the system's biggest fan. And I really got to thank the entire team at Sony Santa Monica. I couldn't have done my best work without them. Every single one of these guys is, the type, they're just so dialed into what they do that it's an incredible place to be a part of. I love this crew and I'm grateful for them. My point is, if you ever get a chance to work with any of them, present or former, you should absolutely jump on the chance. And if that interests you, the easiest way to achieve that may just be to reach out to us. We're hiring for many positions, including tech art and rendering. But if you don't see an open role for your talents and think you can make a strong contribution anyway, I say go for it. We can be flexible, or we might have a place for you in the future. Thanks for joining me, guys. We've got 5 minutes for questions, so.
Please do come to the microphones speedily. No kidding. All right.
All right, none. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, that was fabulous. Let's thank the speaker again. And while I switch out, could I ask all of you, hug your neighbor, get close, feel the community. What I also mean is defrag. We have a lot of people at the back wall, which is fantastic and wonderful, but be kind and sit together. All right, our next topic will be jumping from land to water with multi-resolution water rendering in Crest. There are two contributing authors, Hugh Bowles and Tom Red Cutting. I will only be speaking about Hugh, who will be presenting it today, who is an R&D lead at Electric Square, a game development studio based in Brighton, UK, and part of the Keywords Group. Hugh performs applied research alongside production teams, generally focusing on advanced tools and technologies. Let's welcome Hugh.
Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you very much, Natalia, for the introduction and for having me back here to contribute to this amazing course. Natalia already said that we work at a studio called Electric Square, and I lead an R&D team there called Reactor. So to dive right in 2017, I announced Crest in this course and launched an open source ocean rendering system based in Unity 3D. And from that point, I decided to focus all my hobby time into it to see how far I could push it. We were fortunate to have a couple of teams early adopt and help guide the development. and over time it evolved into a fully fledged product. We kept the core open source so that all of the techniques I presented today are available online, and there is a link. In addition to the free version, we published a lightweight render pipeline version to the Unity Asset Store in March, and we have a HDRP version in the pipeline. Crest is primarily targeted at PC and console platforms, and we'll revisit this point later. We recently assembled our first project reel and wanted to show some great uses of Crest in the wild. So we'll just show you some screenshots from that project reel, and I'll let you look at those. And then there's a second slide with some more examples. As you can see, the projects span a wide range of visual styles and also platforms. The last 5 images are from an example scene that we assembled for our LWRP asset. We now show a quick video of this scene in action. Here is an overview of what we'll cover today. We will start by giving a quick orientation and compare to both our previous work and some other state-of-the-art examples of ocean rendering. We'll then move on to the core contribution of this talk, which is a multi-scale, multi-resolution framework for ocean rendering. This takes advantage of view-dependent level of detail to simulate different types of data at multiple resolutions efficiently, achieving both foreground detail and a very large view range. After establishing this framework, we'll deep dive on a few of the simulation data types to see some unique benefits that our framework provides. Next, we'll give a brief overview of shading the ocean surface itself. We'll be leaning heavily on our work from 2017, which covers the geometry and shading aspects. But we'll recap on it quickly here and talk about how it has evolved since. Next, in the evaluation section, we'll provide some measured performance and memory statistics. Finally, we'll talk about the limitations of our system and discuss our plans for future work. Before we dive into previous work, let's take a quick look at what we mean by multi-resolution. Here's a development screenshot from our Pirate Cove demo scene included in our LWRP asset. The grid of images on the right shows various types of data about the world that is used to render the ocean. Each column is a different type of data. If you look down the columns, you should be able to get a sense that each row shares the same data type and features, but doubles in scale and samples a world at a progressively larger resolution. The previous talk referred to this as logarithmic binning. There's a lot of connections to the previous talk. Just wanted to point that out. The largest textures are in the bottom row, and with this viewpoint, they cover an area of 8 kilometers squared in the world around the viewer. We show the columns in the order they're computed at runtime, and from left to right, they are: the first column is the water depth. The outline of the island is visible in this render target, where the depth of the water is 0. Next is flow. This generates horizontally moving water for the sinkhole. Next, displacements. These define the shape of the ocean surface, and we'll study this in more detail later. Then foam values are generated and used for texturing the ocean surface. Finally, shadowing. After Unity renders shadow maps, we sample from them with jitter to get sharp and soft shadowing terms for the ocean. We don't cover this in this presentation in more detail, but we give notes in additional slides. Nothing is hand-painted or baked in this scene. Everything is dynamic and changeable, and the system is very flexible. This should hopefully give a high-level overview of what our system does, and with that, we're ready to discuss previous work. The volume of ocean rendering literature is very large, and time is way too limited to cover everything, but we'll cite some recent prominent examples of ocean rendering techniques shipped in productions, which can hopefully serve as starting points for further reading. Later in the slides, we'll do more detailed comparisons against some additional approaches. Although we apply our system to more than just wave shape, we feel waves gives a good vantage point for looking at previous work. We'll break down previous approaches based on two categories: animated waves and dynamic waves. Animated waves are stateless, which is great for networking. One approach is to add up individual waves using Gerstner equations, which we'll look at later. This is very controllable, but usually expensive to add enough to get a realistic surface. The work done on the Uncharted series is a notable example of this technique used in production. A more common approach is to perform the fast Fourier transforms to convert a statistical power spectrum into a generated height map with displacements, which can then be tiled in space. Different scales of FFT can be combined, which increases the range of wavelengths. On the other hand, we have dynamic waves. These are generated from a simulation and provide dynamic interaction with the water. We won't deep dive on wave simulation types, but we cite two recent examples of them here. By nature, dynamic waves are not tileable and therefore become expensive fast, which limits their effective range. Yeshke et al. Provides a good discussion of this and contributes interesting work to address this, and we'll revisit this later. The good news is that these approaches can be combined. Animated waves are commonly used for the overall water shape, and then a local dynamic wave sim is added on top. Currently in Crest, we provide a Gerstner wave component. In our framework, we're able to sum many Gerstner waves efficiently, which we'll discuss further in the coming slides. We believe FFTs could also be used as input into our system, but we don't use them at the moment. We also do a ripple simulation to add an interactive layer of water on top. Simulating the dynamic waves at multiple resolutions in our framework allows it to scale to large areas while staying efficient. It's important to note that while we currently ship with these approaches, we describe a general framework in which FFTs and other types of simulations could be added. Another interesting lens to study previous work through is how shape is represented and used to render the ocean surface. There are many examples of directly sampling the generated FFT textures. Recently, this was used in Sea of Thieves, for example, but there's also many others. The Assassin's Creed system renders this shape into a screen space buffer, which can then be manipulated. This provides natural level of detail, which is great for efficiency. Another alternative is to use a set of world space displacement textures, which is the approach we employ. We also found an interesting example of previous work using multiple levels of detail of FFT generated data by Insomniac for Resistance 2. Their displacement textures are generated from FFTs, and they use a scheme where odd levels of detail are 45 degrees rotated. Uncharted 4 uses an interesting combination of procedural elements and additive layers, which we broadly classify as evaluation in the shader here, although it's not that simple, and they have a single local deformation texture, so it's a bit of a hybrid. Predictably, we continue to use the same approach that we talked about last time we talked in this course. This gives a range and efficiency due to levels of detail, but also gives a lot of flexibility in how shape is generated. We use the same data structure to run our dynamic wavesim, which would be difficult to implement in the screen space approach from Seymour due to the non-regular projected grid, and because data behind the viewpoint is not represented, which we want for dynamic waves. Compared to the work from Day, we apply our approach in a more general context than just FFT data and avoid the complexity of the texture rotations. Finally, we compare to our previous work in more detail. Much of the DNA of our current system can be traced back to our 2017 talk in this course. We described a flexible and efficient GPU-based pipeline to render shape from waves or user inputs. We represent the shape in world space displacement textures that follow the viewer around the world. We also described a meshing solution that doesn't require tessellation and is square in shape, which matches the displacement texture shape, and it's a nice synergy there that makes sampling trivial. This is a simple, elegant, and very coherent system for generating displacements on which we have built for the last couple of years. In this talk, we abstract this structure into a general framework on which other ocean data can be implemented, as we saw in the previous slide. This makes it easy to add new data to the system, We demonstrate a number of different types of data being simulated on this framework. We'll also deep dive into a few data types that receive unique advantages from this core data structure. Now that we've covered the previous work, we'll now move on to talk about our multi-resolution framework. We'll focus on displacements, which define the surface shape. The ocean surface is rendered as a horizontal grid on a plane, and the displacements define the offset applied to each mesh vertex and move it to its final position on the ocean surface. Displacement components are visualized in these slides with the colors shown on these axes. Ocean data, such as displacements, are rendered to a texture array. Each slice of the array is a 2D texture, all have the same resolution. We do performance measurement with 512 by 512 textures with 8 slices, which we'd consider to be very high quality settings in Crest. We'll refer to each slice as a cascade from now on. In world space, the cascades are centered at the viewer's horizontal position, and each cascade is 2 times larger than the last. In many of the videos that's recorded for these slides, 8 cascades gave an 8 kilometer squared total area. This is what the cascades look like with false color from the camera point of view. The colors depict where data from each cascade is used. The cascades are also numbered, and arrows illustrate the mapping further, so hopefully that's clear. In this way, the detail on the ocean data falls off linearly with view distance in power of 2 steps. We blend all ocean data smoothly between cascades to avoid any noticeable pops of any kind. This setup scales very favorably. Each time we add a cascade, the view range doubles, so we get a logarithmic scaling of computation and memory with view distance. In addition to moving the cascades around horizontally with the viewer, we dynamically rescale them for the viewer's altitude. Our cascades therefore exist on a sliding scale. This happens with 0 pops through a set of smooth blends. This is entirely handled by our framework and hidden to users. This technique was established in our 2017 talk, but we illustrate the approach here for completeness. Next, we show a quick example of what interacting with our framework looks like for a user who wants to provide input to our system. In this case, we just want to apply a vertical displacement to the surface based on a smooth step function. This input could come from a texture or any other source, really. We add a quad in the world with a shader that returns a height value in the green channel, and we opt for an additive blend mode in this case. We assign a register script which will register the input with the system. And that's all that's required. Then we can hit play and see our bump in action and move it around in the world as desired. Using this workflow, any of the ocean data can be directly influenced in a controllable and localized way, which is great for performance. For example, foam and dynamic waves can be manipulated as required to produce various effects. As another useful byproduct, giving this input data in the distance is still captured into our cascade data and is smoothly blended in when you approach it. The system deals with these inputs efficiently at runtime and does not require baking steps. So to conclude this section, the result of this system is unlimited apparent detail. The domain moves and scales with the viewpoint, and the effect is convincing. We get great efficiencies from taking advantage of perspective projection. We only represent and process data at appropriate resolutions for the current viewpoint. This functionality is abstracted into a data-independent framework. For developers, adding new types of ocean data is simply a case of defining details like the name, texture format, shader used to update the data if required, and then binding the results to the ocean material. For end users, adding data to the system is also straightforward. The result is a simple, unified, tight system, which is quite robust. Finally, as we mentioned briefly at the beginning, we get an accumulated benefit from representing multiple types of data in the same way, in that the various ocean data types can feed into one another. For example, ocean depth informs of foam generation to get shoreline foam, wave attenuation to get the shallow water, and more. To conclude this section, here's another sinkhole vortex scene, which features different data types collaborating to generate the final scene. The procedural flow is affecting the foam sim and the waves. Now that we've covered the overall system, we're going to deep dive further into details specific to the ocean displacements and demonstrate some benefits of our multi-resolution representation. In this work, we enable rendering the displacements in a multi-resolution way. To study this further, we'll look at one source of shape, which are Gersten waves, which ship with Crest. We do the summation of Gersten waves at runtime, which is generally considered to be too expensive, but we get a big speed up from our framework. It's worth noting that the algorithm we present should also apply to FFT data, as we mentioned in the last slides. Before diving into this, let's quickly recap on what Gersten waves are. They're an analytic solution to the wave-induced motion of water particles in deep water. This shows a single wave, which we'll call a wave component. A couple of orange points are highlighted with their trajectories shown. Any point on the wave moves in a circular trajectory with a large radius near the surface and a radius that falls off exponentially as you go underwater. These are the equations. The cosine term gives a vertical displacement for each component, and the sine term gives a horizontal displacement in x and z for each wave component. The combination of sine and cosine gives a circular motion. To generate our ocean shape, we'll sum many of these individual components to get the final result. Adding them up is typically expensive, but since we have a multi-resolution data structure, we separate out the wave components per cascade. In a first pass, we render each wave component to one cascade that suits it best. In this way, we sample the wave components with a prescribed sampling density, which is exposed as a quality slider, but is typically not changed and left at the default value, which is between 3 and 6 samples per wave. So this way, we don't sample too sparsely, which would alias, and we also don't sample too densely, which would be inefficient. Note that we illustrate a single wave on this slide for each cascade, but in practice, multiple wave components are added to make the final surface, and you can see that content in the images there. And the reason why the top ones look gray is just because the amplitude of these waves are small. So at this point, the displacement textures have just the ideal wave components present. To create the final waves, we do a set of combined passes. The results in each cascade are sampled and added up to the next cascade. The open square here, below the arrow, represents a region that will be sampled and added to the next cascade. The process is repeated for each cascade. Each step amounts simply to computing UVs in a larger cascade, sampling the data, and adding it. Once the passes are complete, the large wavelengths have been propagated upwards through the cascades. At this point, all cascades have all wavelengths that can be represented in them without aliasing, and they're perfect. They have the perfect amount of detail. We also get a kind of subdivision behavior from sampling each cascade with a bilinear filter during the combined pass. To understand this, let's look at a diagram of a single cascade. Here, the resolution is 4x4 texels. The lines show the boundaries between the texels, and the circles indicate the centers where the data is located. The next cascade up the chain has the same resolution, but half the size. It will sample the large cascades at the positions shown in those dark green circles. As you can see, these positions are slightly offset from the larger cascade, so when we sample, we get a subdivision effect that looks like the following. Here we show a 1D profile view of a wave, which has been sparsely sampled into the last cascade. The second to last cascade will sample this at slightly offset positions, as shown. And similarly, the next cascade up the chain will again sample at slightly offset positions. You can see this immediately has a smoothing effect on the shape. This means we can sample waves very sparsely and efficiently, and then combining them up the cascade chain automatically subdivides and smooths them. Just to note that the horizontal positions of the samples that I show there, then they would be more equally distributed. In reality, it's just an issue with the diagram there. It's important to note that this is a smoothing operation. In the next video, I show a single wave component, and I reduce the samples per wave from a high value down to a low value, and you can see the smoothing occur. So here's a wave which has been sampled quite densely, and I'm going to reduce the sampling density now in this video, and you'll see the surface get smoother and smoother. You also get the extension in range, so you can see the wave stretching off to the background as well. And that happens naturally with our system. So here's the same effect in wireframe. So again, this is the correct shape of the wave. And now we'll show the smoothing effect that happens if we reduce the samples per wave. So we can see the smoothing effect where the subdivision essentially smooths out our curvature in the wave. This is a limitation of this approach, but we think it's worth the computational benefits and will be naturally compensated when the wave spectrum is tweaked by an artist because they have a chop parameter and amplitude parameters. Also, the smoothing effect can be reduced by increasing the samples per wave at the cost of more samples. Using a different type of interpolation may help reduce the smoothing, but we have not tried this to date. Okay, so now a few implementation notes. We use an efficient Gersten wave shader, which moves as much work as possible out of the core loop and uses 4 wide SIMD to add 4 wave components per iteration. In most of our videos, there are only 8 Gerstner components added per cascade, so it's just 2 iterations of a few instructions. As I mentioned at the start, all the code is online, so I can refer you to that. To give a data point ahead of the evaluation section, we measured summing 224 waves into 8 512 by 512 cascades, and it costed 0.47 milliseconds on this GPU. With these settings, there was enough detail to make additional normal map layers optional, but of course that depends on the project and its needs. In this section, we deep dived on Gersten waves, but it applies to any displacements, and we think FFTs could also work as an input, as I mentioned. Our multi-resolution approach avoids aliasing from undersampling and inefficiency from oversampling. A large, smooth input shape that covers a large area in the world will be sampled very sparsely, independent of the geometry of the ocean. The final pass that combines these displacements subdivides them, which produces smooth results, which we believe is on the whole positive, but worth being aware of. As a final note, we transfer a subset of the displacement textures back to the CPU for physics and gameplay. This has worked really well because it picks up any shape input that's been input into the system. But we're looking at replacing it with a new system that uploads query points to the GPU and then does the queries in compute rather than downloading the textures. So that's the next step for us. In the next section, we'll turn our attention to our dynamic wave simulation component. I'll start this section with a video of what we can achieve. Here, we show a few boats cruising around and interacting dynamically with the water. There is also a ripple effect in the bottom left, and waves propagate with dispersion, meaning larger wavelengths travel faster than smaller wavelengths. Here, we've jacked up gravity to 16 Gs for the dynamic waves to speed them up for aesthetic effect. In the background, we see a pretend ocean liner, and its interactive waves are visible at some distance from the camera. We're able to do all of this efficiently due to the multi-resolution framework. So to take a small step back, we implemented dynamic waves on our framework. We do this with a straightforward implementation of a wave simulation on a height field. Examples of raw simulation data are shown on the right, where red and green represent height and vertical velocity respectively. Wave data is driven to 0 near the boundaries to avoid reflections and streaking when the sims move with the viewpoint. We run multiple wave simulations at different scales independently. Each simulation substep is executed with a single compute shader dispatch. And then we add them together. We do this during the displacement combine pass that we just looked at before. So actually, we mix them in the same pass, and adding them here doesn't require an additional pass. Next, we'll talk about dispersion, which is the phenomena where large wavelengths travel faster than short wavelengths, and it's an important effect to give water a realistic look and feel. The wave equation has a constant for wave speed, and we achieve dispersion by simply varying the wave speed constant per cascade. We set it to the speed of the smallest wavelength that the cascade can hold. Note that this means all waves in the cascade will move at this set speed. This is not a highly accurate solution, but we think this is well suited to games. I'll take a moment to compare a few alternative approaches which, compared to our approach, add complexity or cost. Some approaches have used large Laplacian kernels which actually perform the dispersion and use Laplacian pyramids to improve the efficiency. This itself comes with a cost to make these things work, and it adds complexity to the implementation. Day does the simulation in frequency domain, which requires a FFT back and forth, adding cost and complexity. Yashka et al. Run multiple sims on the same grid to achieve dispersion, but this multiplies the cost of the simulation. Another interesting aspect of our wave sim is that we vary time steps based on the current cascade scales and the stability condition known as the CFL condition. Put simply, in a stable simulation, waves cannot travel further than one grid cell in a single time step. Wikipedia covers it well, and in 2D the formula is shown here. The constant C gives a measure of stability. We use 0.6 for our explicit Euler wave sim. It could potentially be increased for better integration schemes, leading to less time steps. We prescribe this value of C and use the formula to compute the max time step that we can take for the current set of cascade scales. This nicely loads the simulation work and means the sims can be run with coarse time steps if the viewpoint is elevated. As another performance data point, we ran the sims at what we feel is a high resolution, again 512 by 512 times 8 cascades, so again 8 kilometers worth of dynamic waves. For a viewpoint near the surface, this is where the most computation is needed. In this case, the sim required 3 time steps for a 60 Hertz frame, which totals 0.6 milliseconds on this GPU. Next, we describe an approach to reintroduce horizontal motion to the dynamic wave sim results. A pure height field wave sim gives results like this. It lacks the horizontal motion found in water waves, which has both vertical and horizontal components to its motion, and this is important for realism. As discussed, Tessendorf describes how to use FFTs to construct ocean surface heights. Usefully for us, he then outlines a method to generate displacements from the height fields. We take advantage of this latter step. At this point, I have to issue a math warning. These formulas contain non-trivial math, which we're going to have to skim over to justify our approach. The justification is a little bit involved, but what we did in the end was quite simple, so bear with me. So this is a formula from Tessendorf for generating the heights h of an ocean surface. The h tilde inside the sum are the Fourier components which generate a particular surface shape. In our case, we can assume that these weights represent whatever frequency content happens to be in the sim at any time. The last term is a complex exponential and represents a wave. K is the wave vector, it gives the wave direction, and its magnitude is inversely proportional to the wavelength. The key step we're interested in is how displacements are generated from such a height field. Tessendorf gives a second formula for offsetting the surface point x horizontally. It has the Fourier weights and the complex exponential, but adds a few terms to the front compared to the expression for the heights. Here I add a third formula, the spatial derivative of the height, using the grad operator. The sum for the displacements and the sum for the derivative look very similar. The difference is the derivative is missing this term, a divide by the wave number k. Since k is inversely proportional to wavelength, dividing by k is akin to multiplying by wavelength, which makes intuitive sense. Large wavelengths will generate large displacements. We generate displacements from the height field by computing the spatial derivative and then reintroducing the missing factor. We don't explicitly deal with Fourier components or such. We only represent our height field in this way mathematically in these slides in order to explain the technique. However, we face a problem. There are a range of wavelengths in a sim, and the only way to figure out what wavelengths are in there at any time is to actually do a FFT, which is what we want to avoid. The problem is we have the final height field for the wave sim with all the wavelengths mixed in together, and we don't know what they are. We introduce an approximation. We use a single wavelength, which is the average wavelength of waves that would go into that cascade. In reality, the sim will actually contain a range of wavelengths, So picking one wavelength will, in general, either underestimate or overestimate the actual wavelengths that are actually present. We know that the wavelengths in the SIM are bounded from below by Nyquist's limit, so we know how much smaller the wavelengths might be than our approximation. On the other hand, the wavelengths may be much larger than our value. In this case, our wavelength multiplier that we're using will be too small, and our displacement will be underestimated. This is a graceful way for the approximation to break down. If we're overestimating significantly, we'd get extreme displacements and the water surface can invert and self-intersect. On the other hand, not having enough displacement makes the waves look less interesting, but not objectionable. We also note that in Tessendorf, displacements are treated as an art-driven factor anyway, so they are rescaled. So we're just kind of adding a base factor that's multiplied by the chop scale. So all that justification and math boils down to this simple approach. We perform the simulation as usual. At the time that we combine the dynamic sim data into the displacements, which is just before the combine pass, we take spatial derivatives of the height field, multiply this by a factor proportional to the cascade's wavelength, multiply by an additional art-driven factor, and we're done. Note that the central differences derivative is also an approximation technically, but it seems to give good results in our experiments. So here are the results in action. The left shows the simulations without the displacements, and the right shows the final results with displacements. Generating displacements makes the dynamic waves a first-class citizen of the system, so to speak. Its displacement will then generate foam using our foam generation, and it will also inform the light scattering, and also adds horizontal motion to any floating physical objects. So we get a lot of nice results from that. So now we conclude our look at Crest's dynamic wave system. Our multi-resolution approach provides computational efficiency and allows us to simulate on large ranges. Dispersion comes easily by varying the wave speed across the cascades. We built a robust wave sim that chooses adaptive substeps based on viewpoint to save computation when it isn't necessary. Finally, we show how to generate displacements from the final height field using a wavelength estimated for each cascade, which vastly improves the result. Before moving on, we'll take a few moments to contrast a particularly relevant recent work from Jeschke et al. They describe a novel wave simulation that is very efficient and separates out the dynamics from the visual detail. The dynamics is smoothly varying and can be simulated on a coarser grid. This is more efficient, but is still a simulation on a single grid and has the same asymptotic complexity as previous approaches. It's more costly than ours in terms of GPU time and also GPU memory for similar domain sizes in world space. As we mentioned, we achieve our efficiency through view-adaptive level of detail in our framework. They also list perfectly circular ripples as challenging due to the way they discretize their simulation domain. A final consideration is that the generated wavelengths that they get are limited. Adding more wavelengths is possible, but it requires another sim, which increases the cost. On the other hand, their approach produces a lot of visual detail using packets of waves. They also describe how reflections of ambient waves off boundaries can be produced using an offline bake step. In the future, we'd like to investigate driving our dynamic wave sim from the animated ambient waves, which might be a way to achieve some of this effect. But moreover, we note that their approach operates on a grid and it's a simulation, and we speculate that we might be able to add their simulation to our framework. However, we've not explored this and can't speak to what that would look like. The second to last aspect of the multi-resolution framework that we'll study is the light scattering heuristic. Here is an image of the light scattering effect in action, which emulates how light scatters through the water volume and brightens up the waves near the wave crest. We use a similar light scattering term to the Sea of Thieves approach. This light scattering term is based on the length of the horizontal displacement. To see why this works, we've marked the area where the surface point is close to the far right-hand side of its trajectory. This is on the face of a wave, which is where light would scatter through the wave crest. Here we describe a small addition that makes it work well in our framework. We do a kind of normalization by dividing the displacement by the wavelength and use this normalized version for the light scattering term. This is a fairly simple extension, but we thought we'd mention it here as it was not possible to use the displacements directly, for reasons we'll illustrate shortly. Firstly, here's an example of light scattering gone wrong. Our previous light scattering model was based purely on height relative to sea level, which would break easily if the wave conditions change and would need to be retweaked or would need multiple materials to interpolate, which was really annoying. If we simply base the light scattering on the horizontal displacements directly, we get a huge range of light scattering values which are not usable directly. However, if we divide the displacement by wavelength, we get a result that scales much better to large and small waves. Note that I've exaggerated the effect here. The final simulation data type that benefited from our framework is our flow implementation. Flow is an established technique for animating visual features with prescribed velocities. We add flow as a type of simulated data, which can then impact other data, such as the animated waves, foam, and dynamic waves. We also apply this flow to any texturing on the ocean surface to give a coherent result. Here's an example of a flow effect in action. Here, we've frozen the ocean surface in order to focus on the behavior of the flow. This is showing the flow with a 1 second period, meaning the flow effect resets every second. I believe the previous talk referred to that as a flip. We see effective flowing features in the foreground for the smaller waves, but the larger waves in the midground are stationary. The period of 1 second is too short, and they oscillate backwards and forwards without giving the impression of being transported. Also, I'm not sure if it's visible on the projector, but simple two-sample flow can result in visible pulsing, which is the effect that we studied in the previous talk, where the features all phase in and out together at the same time. You may be able to observe this by looking at the foreground and using your peripheral vision. We can try to address this first problem using a larger period. Here we try 4 seconds. This time, larger waves are successfully transported, but now we have extreme distortion in the smaller waves. 4 seconds is much too large for the cycle period for these waves. The flow is now taking enormous strides through the shape texture, which creates stretching and aliasing. In our system, we also vary the flow period for different feature scales, but here we simply make the period proportional to the cascade grid size, which we already have, to adjust the period and get effective flow for different feature scales. We don't actually offset the phase of each flow, but we think that's probably not needed because our ocean system is varying all the time, so the repeating patterns are not so noticeable. But yeah, we reap the benefits of the simple approach of basically having the flow do the correct stride through the texture, but also offsetting the phases so that we can break up those patterns a bit. So here we show the final result once again. So again, we're using two-sample flow, but we're just varying the flow period per cascade. To summarize, we demonstrated how we use flow to inform multiple types of data. We adjust the flow for each cascade to get a good result at all scales. As a bonus side effect, we break up pulsing patterns that are typically visible with two-sample flow. This avoids the need to take more samples or mitigate the problem in other ways. We now touch quickly on some aspects of shading that have evolved since our last presentation. The scale of the cascade is core to the ocean shader and is provided to the shading features for them to use. Now all of our ocean texturing is scaled with the cascades. This allows the texturing to hold up for a large range of viewpoints, including the elevated viewpoint shown here, without getting heavy repetition artifacts. It also helps to combat mip mapping in the distance for shallow view angles. The scale value is passed through from the vertex shader and is an additional multiplier for the world space UVs. We take 2 samples of each texture and then blend them smoothly across the cascades. Note that this blending doubles the number of texture samples, and flow does as well. So 4 texture samples are required if both of these features are enabled. If there are 2 layers of texturing, such as scrolling normal maps, 8 samples are required. So I just wanted to call that out. Anyway, we proposed this in our 2017 talk for normals and provide more details there. But since then, we have rolled it out to all textured elements of the ocean. Having a visual feature present at multiple scales may not suit all projects or all types of data, but it is the default for Crest, and it applies to the foam and the normals, and it has worked really well for us so far. And now I'll briefly show that screenshot full screen to inspect further. So a bunch of this apparent shape that you can see will be coming from the normal maps, but you don't notice any repetition artifacts coming from the normals. Also, as an aside, a bunch of this shape is coming from very large Gerstner wave components, and our Gerstner wave components currently range up to 1 kilometer. Now we'll look at some of the runtime performance characteristics of our approach. Here is an example scene which has all the features enabled simultaneously and uses what we consider to be very high qualities. We measured performance with Nsight graphics on a GeForce GTX 1070 using a standalone Unity build at 1080p. It's worth noting that the cascade resolutions are not dependent on the screen resolution, so these things are detached. We use 512 by 512 cascade resolution with 8 cascades. This is the highest quality settings that we would generally use. We also turn on every type of simulation data to stress test the system. Finally, we ramp up the number of Gerstner components to 224, which is a number we quoted on the previous slide. This is double the default that we ship with Crest. Firstly, we calculated GPU memory usage. The overall is 84 megabytes, and here is a breakdown of the render texture formats and counts. We feel these numbers are reasonable given these settings and the number of features we have. However, there are a number of directions to reduce it, besides the obvious, like reducing the number of cascades or the resolutions. Firstly, it's overkill to represent ocean depth if it doesn't change, so the depth targets could be replaced with a single world space texture. We support changing seafloor depth, which is why we have these targets, but many projects will not require this, so they could bake that out. All our simulation data types are the same resolution. We haven't gotten around to splitting the resolution out. For example, the foam sim and ocean depths could likely be run at lower resolutions. We don't currently foresee any significant issue with making this change, but we haven't tried it. We also believe it would be possible to vary the number of cascades per data type. For example, foam may not be needed over 8 square kilometers. We sort of leave this stuff in because we want to make Crest as flexible as possible for any kind of project, but we believe it should be possible to vary the cascade count per data type, but we have not evaluated what that would mean for the code changes. We haven't gotten around to making use of temporary render targets, so that I think is a low-hanging fruit, which could enable reuse of memory. And finally, we haven't looked into lowering precision. Currently, all our targets are 16-bit floats, and some of them need this precision, but it might be possible to pack others down. Now we look at the computation time. All processing is done on the GPU. The total frame time in this scene was 6.6 milliseconds. For the update of the ocean simulation data, we measured under 2 milliseconds to update with all the features turned on with a total coverage of 8 kilometers squared. The breakdown is shown on this slide. There's a couple of notable points that I'd like to call out. The foam sim does a single update performed in a single dispatch of a compute shader. The dynamic waves were updated in 3 substeps in this 60 Hertz frame, so 3 dispatches. Flow is enabled and currently operates everywhere, so we're actually doing all the cost of the flow samples globally. For drawing the ocean surface itself, we timed it at 0.98 milliseconds in this view. In this scene, the ocean accounted for 170,000 triangles. The mesh density generally tracks with the resolution of the cascades, but there's more details in our previous talk about that. But it also covers the same range. We note that there are a number of optional shader features, and this has all the nice-to-haves turned on, like procedural normals generated for the foam layer. So we think there's probably some features that could be turned off to save some time here as well. For improvement directions, we'd actually call out exactly the same directions as we mentioned on the previous slide, but with a couple of additions. We render all our data centered on the viewpoint and surrounding it. One question is why we don't focus on rendering data that is strictly within the view frustum. We decided not to pursue this in Crest, partly because it's not always easy to tell what's in the view frustum when you have horizontal and vertical displacements, but more so because we have persistent data like foam and dynamic waves, and we want those things to be simulating all the time, even when the viewer turns their back. Having said that, for some projects, this optimization may work out really well and could potentially reduce the processing cost by a factor of 2 or more. As a second direction, we believe that async compute can be used for the ocean update, the results of which are not needed until after the opaque pass. We looked into this and encountered limited platform support, so we're parking this direction for now. This could work on some projects though. Finally, we'll briefly look at another scene with Crest default quality settings. So this time we have 7 cascades and 256 by 256 resolution. Normal maps are necessary in this case to add visual detail to the waves. So halving the resolution reduces the memory usage by a factor of 4, predictably, and GPU time is also reduced to almost 1/4, so it also scales predictably. So 0.53 milliseconds when all the ocean features are enabled. We kept the same number of triangles and shading features, so drawing the ocean surface was a similar cost. We now discuss some limitations of our technique. Firstly, having all 3 rendered textures means there are more passes than might be required by other systems. Having all of these rendered textures means that there are more passes than other systems would have. This depends on which features are active and how many user-provided inputs are being rendered into the data. In the Pirate Cove scene, with an elevated perspective, with all ocean features turned on, Unity reported 242 batches attributable to the ocean. We've done some experimentation with using geometry shaders to render inputs to multiple cascades simultaneously, but it sort of introduced some complexities to our shaders, and we want to find a more elegant way to integrate it. So that was something that we ran up against. We also don't instance the geometry tiles of the ocean, which would also help slightly reduce this number. But this number of batches is a primary reason we believe our current implementation is best suited to PC and console platforms, but we do have some users using it on medium to high-end devices. Our second limitation is that our cascades cover a large area in the world and follow the viewer around. This is a natural fit for big expanses of water, but less suitable for local water bodies like lakes. We think it would be possible to only run the updates specific to the local areas where they're needed. And we also propose some solutions to cull the meshing where it's not needed in our 2017 talk, but we haven't pursued this direction further, so we don't know how viable it is. A final limitation is one that is shared by any system that does a dynamic wave sim using a render texture that moves around in the world. If the camera moves really quickly, the render texture will move and actually wipe the results from the sim. The effect of this is you might see a boat in the distance with a wake, and if you move very quickly to it, you'll see a low resolution wake for a few seconds until more higher detailed waves are populated and start propagating. We've not found this to be a significant issue so far. Now we discuss a few directions for future work. Firstly, we aim to expand the different simulation types. One idea might be to add a shallow water simulation for rivers. Another idea that was requested was a wetness simulation for sound. It might also be interested to simulate light transport in 2D to get better lighting of the volume. And we're also interested in simulating wind, but I think our system is best suited for 2D, while more work would be needed to adapt this for 3D texture or 3D simulations. As mentioned previously, we also want to investigate if there are benefits to implementing water surface wavelets on our framework, but would also like to look at some of the components they have, like the really detailed wave profiles, and see if we can actually incorporate that into our system. Finally, we'd like to support local bodies of water better and prove out our ideas for this. In conclusion, we believe we've created a data structure that is a natural fit for ocean rendering. Since moving to it, we've discovered a number of synergies where an effect or a calculation benefited from having multiple resolutions of data present. We built a general framework to implement this data structure that hides the implementation details and gives the impression of unlimited detail to the viewer. Our close connection to perspective provides apparent detail while scaling up to large view distances. A few components of our system were literally transformed when we moved them onto this framework. The Gerstner wave computation received a huge performance boost by splitting out components across the cascades. We can therefore sum up enough Gerstners to give a detailed result within real-time budgets. The impact was even greater for our dynamic wave sim. Using our framework, we can simulate dynamic waves over large distances. We vary the number of wave steps to save computation when the viewer is not too close to the surface. We show how dispersion is trivially achieved in our system, and we also show that we can approximate the displacements, which gives a big improvement in fidelity and quality. For the light scattering and flow effects, knowing the scale of the data made these features more versatile and more effective. All in all, we achieve good results with very simple approaches that are relatively easy to implement and maintain. Finally, we evaluated our approach to show very favorable performance. In particular, our dynamic wave sim outperforms state-of-the-art significantly. So that brings me to the last slide. I'd like to thank Tim Chapman and my friends at Electric Square for supporting this work. We're hiring multiple roles, including R&D roles, so please get in touch if interested. As I mentioned, all approaches are implemented in our public GitHub and MIT license, so you can grab them from there. We have also just created a brand new repository to collect ocean rendering links and resources, and contributions to that are very welcome. I'd also like to thank Patrick Prosic for putting together the Pirate Cove scene and rdtextures.com for generously providing the terrain textures. And with that, I'll thank you for your attention and invite questions. Please come to the microphones.
All right. Well, let's thank the speaker for an amazing talk. Thank you. And all the speakers will be here after, so if questions bubble up to the surface, pun intended, come by after. Our next talk will be focused on creating the atmospheric world of Red Dead Redemption 2, a complete and integrated solution. Fabian Bauer is a senior graphics programmer at Rockstar North, working on real-time rendering features for latest Rockstar titles, including volumetric and ambient lighting. Previously, he has worked at Crytek at Dambuster Studios as part of the rendering R&D team. Please welcome the speaker.
Hey folks, hello and welcome to my talk about how we created the atmospheric world of Red Dead Redemption 2. We're having a look at the unified approach we took to cover a large variety of volumetric material, large and small scale, and we'll have a look at the challenges we had to overcome to make this run on the current generation of consoles. Yes, that's good. Okay, first of all, let's have a look at some footage. So Red Dead Redemption 2 is an open-world Western game with a dynamic time of day, weather cycles, and several climate regions. The system supports the cloudscape, fog effects, and it needs to work in all sorts of weather situations, like thunderstorms, but also overcast weathers and clear skies. Just let this sink in a little. And of course also we need to be able to go into the cloudscape for high altitude areas like the snowy mountains where we support snowstorms and dynamic transitions for blizzards. This is also true for the localized clouds and nighttime scenes, where we have volumetric lights interacting with the fog material, and dynamic events like dust being kicked off the ground as same part of the solution, and the sandstorms as well. For motivation, the game takes place at the turn of the century. So we are facing a lot of undeveloped wilderness over several distinct climate regions, with a heavy focus on natural light, where the sky is the main contributor. Sky rendering was already an integral part of the first Red Dead Redemption, so for the sequel we wanted to take it to the next level. The art department was inspired by many American landscape painters of that era, like Albert Bierstadt, Asher Brown Durand, and Frederick Edwin Church. And as you can see in these paintings, volumetric effects are an integral part of the scene, not only as a backdrop for the skybox, but also as a part of the lighting solution, changing the mood of the picture. We're seeing a wide variety of effects, from clouds to fog, haze, and light rays. The physical basics behind this, if we focus on single scattering, are essentially like this. We are interested in the light that reaches the camera from a surface. If we look at a particle of a participating medium that is in the way of that light path, that needs to be taken into account. The incoming light on such a particle is to some degree absorbed and transformed into, for instance, thermal energy, or scattered back into the scene. So that's either outscattered, where the light can interact with other particles or surfaces again, which is called multiscattering, but the inscattered part reaches the camera and is the part we are interested in for single scattering. And of course, as long as there are more particles in the way, these need to be integrated as well. The scattered light is essentially the sum over all participating lights on a particle, where we need to accumulate the contribution of the light luminance modulated by the visibility of the light source, as well as the phase function, which gives it a directional scattering behavior. The transmittance over the light path is essentially an exponential decay function, here modeled as Beer's law, where the extinction parameter of the material is taken into account. And the extinction itself is the sum of both absorption and scattering parameters. So at the end of the day, we want to integrate over this light ray, and this is how that function looks. I won't go into too much detail on that, since we have seen so much of this already today. So the design goals for our system were to target a unified volumetric rendering approach, where we handle all these effects we've seen in the paintings in a single system with the shared lighting and data model, and covering all these effects, both large and small scale, but also seamlessly integration for interiors and exteriors. So what we wanted to avoid is cases where the camera moves from the exterior to an interior, and we have to essentially switch the lighting solution on or off based on that context, and potentially introduce popping. And of course, we want to follow the physical basics of what we just saw. However, it also needs to be scalable for low and high-end platforms. Previous work on this, we've seen analytical models and ray-marched fog, and more recently, the fairly popular volumetric fog approaches with frostum-aligned volumes, as well as ray-marched cloudscapes and large-scale atmospheric scattering models using lookup tables. For this talk, we have 3 chapters. First, we'll look at the data model. Then we'll move over to rendering and how we visualize these data models. And finally, the scene integration and how we put these algorithms to use. So data model is first. And we'll have a look at how we generate cloud data as well as fog data. For clouds, we look at a cloud map, which is essentially a top-down representation of the cloud dome, which covers the full visible world. And it is modulated by a set of textures like masks and noise textures, as well as weather and time of day parameters. And as a result, we generate a 2-channel texture where each channel represents a cloud layer. So in practice, this is how it looks if both channels were blank. So no clouds are visible in the scene. Then with layer 1, where we're using a mask, and layer 2, which relies on more procedural look of noise. So we have a way to place clouds in a 2-dimensional top-down way, but we still need to define the shape over height. And we do this with a lookup table, which allows us to give the clouds a characteristic shape approximating cumulus and stratus types. This is the cloud atlas that we are using, and each weather essentially corresponds to one strip in this texture, which we can then copy into our runtime lookup table, and that allows us to blend several weathers together, which is very useful for weather transitions. That gives us a base shape for clouds. Now we still need to add some detail to that. And we are following a similar implementation to Schneider 15. And this works by carving out the cloud detail from the base shape using noise textures. And we displace the noise lookup with 2 displacement samples from a 2D texture. We do that at the X, Y, and XZ position of the sample position we're interested in. And use that offset then in conjunction with wind to sample a 3D Perlin-Whirly noise volume. In practice, this is how it looks if we don't apply any noise, so just the base shape of the clouds. This is done by relying on Hermite interpolation, like it's seen in this code snippet. This is how it looks if we just apply the 3D noise erosion, done like this, using a rescale function also known as linstep or inverse lerp. And we use one of the cloud lookup table channels to adjust the softness of that, which allows us to change the appearance of that noise over height. And this is how it looks once modulated with the displacement vector. And this pretty much covers it for how we generate the cloud shapes, but we can reuse the cloud map in other ways as well, like in this case, by placing rain-based fog below rain clouds. So we derive that by the density in that weather map and apply a height-based fall-off to connect it with the base shape of the cloud, which looks like this. Moving forward, fog is done in a very similar way. We have a fog map, which covers only the playable map, and it consists of 3 channels. First, the fog start height, which is essentially the height map of the world, and then the fog fall-off distance on top of that, which is where we apply the fall-off of the density, and then the density itself in the blue channel. This is also done in a composition pass, where we then apply both weather and time of day parameters once again, which allows us contexts like morning mist over large water bodies. As time of day progresses, it dissipates. This is how it looks in practice if we don't have any fog applied from the fog map. Now with just some global exponential height-based fog. And finally, we fill in the blue channel of the map, which gives us a more localized look to the fog. As you can see, there's more of it now appearing over the river, as well as on vegetation-dense areas. Another way to do localized fog is using fog volumes. And we support them by allowing the artist to place them in the world, attach them to particles or vehicles, and they come in sphere or box shape, and support both additive or alpha blending. We use alpha blending mainly for interiors, where we want to exclude the environmental fog from the outside, but still provide a volumetric context or atmospheric context for the interior. And we use additive volumes for points of interest like these hot springs, which allows us to provide a more detailed placement than the fog map would provide, but it's also used to dynamically add volumes to the world, like for explosions or fires. So this pretty much covers the data model. Now let's have a look at how we can visualize it. We'll be looking at the scattered light at a given sample position and how we organize the samples using a frost and volume approach as well as ray marching, and then we'll have a look at the performance of these. So in a nutshell, for anything in the near distance, we are relying on a frostum voxel grid using voxelization of fog. And anything after that point, we render using ray marching. So this tells us where samples are, but what are we doing at every sample position? First of all, the shading model is a single scattering-based model where transmittance is wavelength independent as well. And we approximate multi-scattering by applying 2 direct light octaves. If we recall, the scattered light sum is modulated by a phase function as well as visibility, and the visibility is basically done by relying on shadow map lookups and in some cases secondary rays. But first let's define the phase function. We've built this function employing both artistic liberties as well as performance considerations. And we started by looking at the Heiny-Greenstein phase function, HG, which looks like this. It's very effective when describing forward scattering intense materials. So we started with that and modulated it slightly by adding several more octaves of it, controlled by the artist weights W0 and W1, as well as the extinction of the material. And each octave basically has a lower anisotropy than the previous one. And this allows the construction of more complex scattering lobes. But in the end, we settled with 2 octaves in total for diminishing returns as well as performance considerations. Now the HG phase function is still strongly forward scattering oriented, so we are lacking a plausible backscattering effect, especially on more dense material. And we fake that by essentially clamping to the 1/pi term from the Lambertian BRDF. That's a hack, so yes, it's not physically based, but we still correlate it with the extinction of the extinction parameter of the material, as well as some perceptual tuning, which can be represented with this code snippet. And in practice, we never get that high, so we never reach 1/pi, which would otherwise result in a energy additive way, which we don't want to do. If we visualize these 3 components then, low density fog, like this, with a high forward scattering component. We look at the first octave in the red channel. The green channel is basically blank, as well as the backscattering clamp in blue, which is because the density of the fog is very low. For high density fog, with the same anisotropy, we are now adding some of the second octave as well as some backscattering. And for cloud material, which is strongly scattering but has a low absorption, we have still high anisotropy, but a much stronger backscattering effect as well as secondary lobe. And for material like smoke, where the absorption is very high and the anisotropy is almost isotropic, we have a very strong backscattering effect. This is how the octaves look in practice. So we're now looking at the very first one only. So we see the forward scattering very directly where the sun shines towards the camera, but the clouds on the sides look very pale. The second octave fixes this, but we're still lacking some of that grounding, which the backscattering clamp provides. And as you can see, these 2 additions barely modify the fog below the clouds because of the lack of extinction. Let's move on to visibility. As I mentioned before, this mainly relies on shadow map lookups. And we use both cascade shadows as well as local lights to do that. But we also generate terrain shadows and cloud shadows. On cloud material, we also want to provide more high-frequency detail by casting a secondary ray, which in our case consists only of a single transmittance-based lookup towards the directional light direction, with a variable distance, which allows the artist then to use a shorter distance on weathers with small clouds to preserve that detail, and vice versa. The terrain shadow map is generated by ray marching a terrain height map, which looks like this. And what we are storing is the intersection height on that, over that distance, as well as the ray length towards the intersection. And for each sample position, all we have to do then is compare the height of that sample with the height fetched from this map, and then adjust the fall off using the ray length, which essentially gives us a cheap way to approximate soft shadows. The cloud shadow map also stores directional light shadows only, but this time using exponential shadow maps. And we generate it by ray marching the cloud data. So we track a ray through the cloud material, and we store the transmittance weighted depth that results from this. So it is a very opaque way to represent cloud material, but the assumption here is that clouds get very dense, casting close to opaque shadows, and the expense of evaluating the ASM is also very low, which we will have to do a lot. We store this in a 16-bit float texture over 6 MIPS, which we then blur and generate a MIP chain from to reduce both aliasing and texture crawling. For ambient light, we reuse the directional light secondary ray samples for visibility, once again, to provide an approximation of the environmental density, because otherwise we'd have to cast rays in isotropic fashion into all directions. And the ambient light itself, for the ray marching part, is coming from an average sky ambient term that we generate without clouds in them. And this is done by rendering the sky scattering term, both Rayleigh and me, into a low-resolution paraboloid texture, over which we apply parallel reduction with samples weighted higher, pointing towards the sun or moon. The view-frustum volume instead samples an irradiance probe field, which includes these terms, but also some indirect bounce light modulated by ambient occlusion. In practice, this is how it looks if we don't use any ambient light. Then using the sky average, which adds the typical bluish hue. And what we use now, the irradiance-based lookup, which adds the green tint bounced off the ground, as well as the darkening below the trees. So it pretty much covers it for the ambient light, but we are also adding local lights. And we do this by sampling a light cluster volume, also oriented around the camera, and integrate the light term from there. The visibility is resolved by looking up the shadow maps, so no ray casting going on for this. And we are only using a single HG phase octave for simplicity and performance. Rainbows are supported as well. They are not artist-placed, but instead part of the rendering process in this system. And we support them as full rings, inner and outer rainbow, which can be visible on high altitudes only. And they are not 100% physically based. We do evaluate the light direction as well as the view direction to map that angle to a rainbow color space. But we treat the result like an additional light source, which we add on top of the scattered light sum. And we control the intensity of that by using a material parameter called water droplet density. Lightning strikes are also added on top of that light sum, and this is done in a more brute force-ish way, where each lightning strike adds a point light to a point light array, over which we loop at each sample position, apply an exponential falloff plus, once again, the hg phase function, and use the local extinction to provide some indirect shadows, so no complex raycasting. And this is, again, added on top of the scattering term, which looks like this. In summary then, if we look at the sample position here, this is the visibility ray, which we look up towards the directional light. Then the first octave, second octave, and the backscattering term, which is more like a hemispherical approximation. Then lightning strikes or other lights that we want to integrate, and ambient light represented as an isotropic phase. So let's have another look at how we organize the sample positions. So for the near distance, we have the frost and voxel grid. And the depth coverage of this grid is usually at around 160 meters, but it is possible to reduce that distance for interiors so that the artists can control the sample frequency in high density areas. We divide the volume into 3 clip space volumes. We have the shadow volume, material volume, as well as the scattered light and extinction volume. And the resolution of all of these volumes is 160/8864. The shadow volume stores the directional light shadow term from the shadow map cascade and the cloud shadow map and terrain shadow map we looked at earlier. And we apply temporal filtering on this volume to improve stability in cases where we undersample the cascade. The material volume is storing 8 parameters in total in 2 subvolumes. And the first volume stores the scattering and absorption coefficients. And the second volume stores the anisotropy of the phase function in red, and a global emissive term in green. Now, we don't have a way to assign emissiveness to fog volumes or material in general. We only have a global emissive intensity, a 0 to 1 value, which controls the contribution of a global emissive term, which is shared across the whole volumetric system. And we also have an ambient intensity, which we store in the blue channel, which allows us to basically overestimate the ambient occlusion, which is very useful for interiors where we don't have such high frequency data. And the alpha channel stores the water droplet density mentioned before to control rainbow placement. For fog volumes, we support up to 32 of these. They are organized in a cluster grid similar to the lights, which is implemented by using Z-binning. The material volume is responsible for sampling and blending all the material parameters. For fog volumes, we have to follow a certain blending order since we support both additive and alpha blending. And we start with additive, then go on and blend the alpha volumes on top, and finally the volumes attached to particles last. This allows us to place large volumes around whole street blocks and then use alpha volumes to carve out interior rooms and still be able to add particle-based volumes for the dynamic events, explosions, fires, or just a smoky saloon atmosphere. And these are all modulated by individual tiling noise samples. We do temporally filter the volume, but only scattering and absorption coefficients. And we use the wind velocity as a motion vector. The wind system for the fog is fairly naive, so we only have a global wind direction, which we push a tiling noise volume through, And to temporally reproject that, we use it as the motion vector. And we have to, however, fix leaking issues with that. Imagine an interior with no fog and fog in the exterior, and each voxel in the volume that is in the interior will now try and reproject using the wind, which can end up in the outside, which then gives you unwanted leaking and trailing issues. So with this volume, we prevent that by essentially setting the magnitude of the reprojection vector to 0 for all alpha-based volumes, so that we don't have these problems. The scattered light volume samples both the result of the material volume and the shadow volume pass, and applies all the direct light terms as well as the ambient light from the irradiance probe map. It does that by storing the scattered light in the first 3 channels and takes over the extinction of the material, which we then both sample in a final slice marching pass for the inscattering and transmittance term. And this accumulation volume that we get out of this is then used to sample in both deferred and forward rendering. Now we don't apply any temporal blending on the scattered light volume. This is to prevent light ghosting from not only moving lights, but also when the camera moves in strongly forward scattering environments. So if we look at an example, we have a light source like this, which scatters strongly towards the camera. In the next frame, the camera moved, the scattering behavior now changed the direction. But if we reproject that value, we'll introduce a temporal lag and overestimate the scattering intensity in that direction. Instead of this, we are relying on dithered lookups of the accumulation volume and use TAA to stabilize the final result. Frostum volumes have a problem at a certain distance. This is not only because of the limited resolution they have, but also because of the exponential slice distribution. So the further the voxel is away from the camera, the larger it will be, which causes unstable results, even if we temporally integrate heavily. So we need a system to take over at some distance, and that's the ray marching system. For this system, we can ignore certain effects like fog volumes or the irradiance probe lookup and local lights, since we don't have that data in that distance anyway. And the ray length in that system is defined by the screen depth or the ground plane and cloud dome. So we don't cast or we don't sample anything outside of these bounds. And we apply an iterative refinement of the step base length as we ray march, so that we get more samples on cloud material. As an example, if this is our ray, and we test using the base shape of the cloud, then now we're inside, which means we have to refine the step size. So we go back by half, test again, we're still inside. So we go back by half again. Now we're not inside, which means we can move forward. But now we're inside, so back it is. And we do this for as many iterations as we want. In this case, it's 4 iterations in total. And when we're happy, we can march on. This is not perfect though. We can still potentially jump over certain thin clouds or flat clouds, depending on what the initial base step was, so that we miss the whole iteration step altogether. So the base step length, as well as the cloud data, needs to be tuned in according to that. So the main viewport ray marching starts where the voxels end. And we offset the ray by using a blue noise offset. And the target resolution of the ray marcher is half res of the screen resolution, which is sufficient for our data, but still expensive to do. So we have to rely on a reconstruction approach, which we run over 4 frames. Let's have a look at that. So in this example image, we are casting 1 out of 4 rays, which can look like this, and we reproject the rest, the ones we've skipped. For example, if we have to reproject this pixel, then we have to validate it using the 3x3 neighborhood of the color AABB around it, similar to TAA approaches. On depth discrepancies, however, as you can see on this example, the scattering term and the transmittance term from the ray result can vary greatly. So usually the longer the ray is, the higher the scattering, and vice versa for short rays. So depth discrepancies cause issues where the color bounding box gets very large. If we look at this pixel here then, we want to make sure that we only use neighborhood samples that make sense for the current pixel we want to validate. So what we do is we apply a refinement over the neighborhood and drop neighborhood results which have a very high depth difference to the pixel we're interested in. And if we don't have any history, like on frostum edges, then we just use the nearest depth sample from the neighborhood. So as you can see, it's very important to place these rays in a cohesive way. And we start by doing a checkerboarded min-max depth downsampling to provide us with our target resolution depth. But we can still have problems on high variance depth discrepancies, which can be introduced from stochastic effects like vegetation, hair, and others. So once again, the goal is cohesive depth coverage. And the initial attempt, as we just seen, is a uniform ray position based on the current frame index. So we take 4 frames to completely reconstruct the image. And this is the placement, so essentially a clockwise distribution of the array. But if we look at a depth buffer like this, which is very characteristic of a depth buffer you can get from a min-max downsample and stochastic effects, then in the first frame we get this coverage, which yields a min-max, which is both low and high. So we have potential candidates for a valid neighborhood if we have to refill all the gaps for both long and short rays. This also works in the second frame. But the third frame now is only casting long rays. So all the short rays we'd have to reproject from the previous frame can't be validated since the bounding box is not valid anymore, is not trustworthy. In the last frame this works again, but we've now introduced a flicker from the second frame. So the second attempt then is to start with the frame index once again, but now add a +1 offset in a checkerboarded fashion. So this is how the first frame looks then. So every other 2x2 tile is now offset by 1. It's frame 2, 3, and the final one. And if we look at this depth buffer again, then we can see now first frame works like it did before. Same for the second one, third one, and the last one. Now this is great, right? We're done, right? This doesn't need any help at all. So yes, it can still go wrong, of course. If we look at this example, for instance, and frame 3, then we are now only casting short rays, so nothing to fill in these gaps. What we have to do is we move it to a long ray, which then is used to fill in the neighbors. And we do this in the third attempt by using the checkerboarded offset from before, but with a depth neighborhood analysis on top. So what we have to do is we have to compare the length of each neighborhood ray, and if it turns out that both min-max of the neighbors are casting short rays, then we have to use the other extreme for the current 2x2 tile we're interested in. So in this case, all neighbors are casting short rays, so if we have the option between short and long ray, then we have to use a long ray. Now this gives a more or less reliable half-resolution image, but we still need to upscale this to full resolution. If we just go with a bilinear upscale like this, then we can see the blue noise offset we've applied earlier. So what we do is we apply a dithering to the lookup by casting 4 tabs into the result, and then pick the closest depth on depth discrepancies or average it out otherwise. And we control the width of these tabs by the weighted ray length so that we don't overblur clouds that are very far away. And in conjunction with TAA, the results get soft. We also do this on the accumulation volume, as I mentioned earlier. So the bilinear upscale is giving us a very blocky look, but in conjunction with TAA and dithering, this gets resolved. The performance of all of this is heavily dependent on the cloud cover, fog composition, number of lights, and fog volumes, etc. So yes, artists are responsible too. It's not just us. And as you can imagine, the ray marching is the worst offender, especially with long rays that have to cast for a long time, where we have to take many steps, probably also through clouds. So in this example here, we can see which ones are the most expensive rays. And what we want to do is essentially avoid wavefronts that have to loop in this ray for a very long time, while others are already done with their workload, and which reduces utilization. So what we did is we leveraged async compute, since this whole thing is compute-based, which allows us then to overlap the approaches and implementations here, as well as overlap dispatches by themselves. So what we do is we overlap all the volume approaches with the ray march to improve on utilization. On top of that, we also time slice certain things like the terrain shadow map and the cloud shadow map, where the cloud shadow map is basically done and fully rebuilt over 16 frames. And these are the numbers that we are getting on PS4 base. The ray march reconstruction is a fixed cost, and the ray march and of course the volumetric approaches are based on data. And as you can see, yes, the ray march is the slowest component. This covers it for the rendering part. Now let's have a look at how we put these into the scene. We'll have a look at how we render the main viewport effects, but also the impact on lighting, like on irradiance, directional light, and reflections. First of all, for the main viewport, we are relying on a pre-computed sky scattering approach. We apply the improvements from Hilaire et al., like the ozone parameter, but we are also supporting the Earth shadow, which makes the lookup table slightly more complicated. But we felt that in an open world game like this, Earth shadowing is an important part for dynamic time of day. And we are also time slicing the update of this. This is the frostum volume resolution we are using, and that's the lookup table then for both forward and deferred. Now, technically, sky scattering for the ray marching and volumetric approaches would have to be applied at each sample point that we want to generate. But this is very expensive. So we rely on the weighted depth of the ray to apply it only once and separate the visibility from the integration, which once again is technically not accurate, but yields plausible results by accumulating the shadowed area across the ray and attenuate the value with the transmittance on the ray. So this is how the weighted depth looks. This is how the accumulated shadowed area looks. And then combined together, we get a plausible visibility for atmospheric scattering, which results in the God rays in the distance. The main viewport applies all these effects we've looked at, all these approaches in a deferred way. So we look up the accumulation volume, and we merge that with the ray marched lookup, and then apply the sky scattering on top. And we accumulate also a cirrus cloud layer, which is just a single lookup at high altitude from a pre-generated art-designed texture. But we only use it for density estimation and still apply the same shading model as before. So it's essentially like a dedicated sample at very high altitude that we don't have to search for. So let's apply each of these things one by one. So this is the cirrus layer, then the ray marched result. Now the volume, now we get some more detail up front. And finally, the sky scattering, which grounds the volumetric effects in the scene. Now this has a big impact on the whole image, so we need to take it into account for the sky irradiance as well. For that we have a probe grid, 32 by 32, which capture the sky irradiance and encode this in third-order spherical harmonics. We place these probes by using a height map and a bend normal map. And the bend normal map essentially dictates the geometric occlusion for the hemisphere of that probe and the direction as well. And then each of these probes casts a number of rays into the volumetric scene and accumulates both in-scattering and transmittance, which then modulates the sky scattering paraboloid lookup that we've used earlier to generate the sky ambient. And doing this allows us to have both the characteristic blue sky when the weather is clear and get a cloud-shaped, a cloud-colored ambient when it's overcast. In practice, this is how it looks if we don't apply any ray marching to the irradiance probes. So the ground is way too blue for the overcast sky that we're looking at. And this is when we apply the ray marching on top. So we now get contact hardening shadows where the terrain is high and close to the cloud layer and on the right side, as well as bright patches of light breaking through the cloud layer where the density gets thin. And this is how it looks with directional light on top. The sky radiance probe maps also base the original coefficients term for our higher resolution probe grid, which we use for our indirect light. And to pay for all of this, we obviously have to look at how we ray march. So we are not doing as many steps as we would do for the main view. There's no refinement phase as well. So we're taking fairly large ray steps with a reduced detail, no noise erosion whatsoever. And we run a classification pre-pass based on the visibility of the probes. So visible probes are casting more rays than invisible ones, but we still need to cast invisible probes and update those because of visibility from reflections. And we generate the ray marching term by casting one ray per thread and then apply parallel reduction in shared memory when we sum all these coefficients up. And all of this costs us 0.22 milliseconds on PS4. The directional light merely applies the cloud shadow map, so no ray casting going on for this. But it's enough to connect it to the God rays of the sky as well, so no screen space effect being applied here. For reflections, we also have to take the volumetric scene into account. And the majority of reflections in our game is coming from a cube map, which we update at the camera position. So we do basically the same thing for the volumetric ray marching in a much lower resolution cube map, and once again simplified. But it needs to match the sky irradiance probes for the proper BRDF model. And we do this in 0.15 milliseconds on PS4. Water reflections are a little different. They're a mix of screen space reflections, the reflection probe we just looked at, planar reflections, and height map tracing. But we apply the SSR component of this without any alpha or volumetrics. We'll have a quick look soon on why that is. But what we are doing is we apply a dedicated ray march on the whole water reflection solution, once again simplified, and using a heavy temporal blend, using a exponential running average. So why are we not just reflecting the clouds from the SSR? This is how that would look. So of course we get the usual edge issues for screen space effects, but we are also missing reflections now, since the clouds aren't in the depth buffer and wouldn't have been found from the screen space ray march. Also, we are essentially applying in-scattering and transmittance twice now on the reflected surface, which is coming from the fact that the reflected pixel already has scattering and transmittance applied from the previous frame, and now gets another dose of that from the ray which hits the water level itself. So to prevent all these issues, that's why we cast the rays once again, which fixes all these problems and gives a much more coherent reflection result. That's the resolution we are doing this in, and all of this costs us 0.19 milliseconds on PS4. So in conclusion then, I think we have reached our goal. Volumetric effects are first-class citizens now. We've found a way to unify a wide variety of materials in a sort of physically based multi-material way, where we use frustum-aligned volumes for anything in the near distance with an advanced feature set like fog volumes, local lights, and irradiance probe sampling. And anything in the far distance used is implementing ray marching, which relies on temporal reconstruction over 4 frames, but can be reused and reutilized for indirect diffuse and specular. So these are a couple of things you want to look at in the future. So we want to go even wider on materials, potentially using lookup tables, etc. Then we also want to make transmittance wavelength dependent, and also have a look at how we can do volumetric shadows, which we are not supporting at this point, more localized weather as well, and as usual with ray marching, better denoising. So that brings us to the end of the talk. I'd like to thank the Rockstar Graphics and Lighting team for their collaboration on this system. I want to thank Natalia for giving us this chance to talk about it, and of course all of Rockstar Games for their contribution to this huge project. And thank you for listening. And we're hiring.
So we have a few minutes for questions. As usual, please come to the center for the microphones. And don't be shy.
Do you account for multiple scattering while doing ray marching, or was that everything using single scattering?
It's mainly single scattering. We just approximate the multi-scattering component by just applying multiple octaves of direct light. So it is more of a hack. We are not tracking any photons.
But when you calculate light for every sample along the ray, are you casting another ray into direction of sunlight, for example?
Yes, that's only done on cloud material, though, to give it that additional high-frequency detail. It's that secondary lookup we do, which is only a single tap. So the distance of that lookup needs to be controlled by art.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I can't tell if that was a cloud of questions or exiters. Well, thank you very much for the great talk. Let's thank the speaker. So, I know I beat this to death. Slides will be posted. Stay tuned. Fill out the evaluations. You guys now know the drill. It's in applications for both of the courses individually. And a reminder, there are quite a lot of companies that are seeking talented engineers, tech artists, developers. Definitely reach out and let them know if you're interested. And most importantly, just in closure, without any slides, I wanted to thank you. We are lucky to have an audience like you. We're lucky to have the opportunity to share the technology. And we're also lucky that the companies are seeing the value of being forthright about how we implemented these techniques. You probably got a good glimpse of the complexity of just even, individual components alone, what it takes now to implement these in games. I had a funny conversation, a few years ago when I was in the AAA company about, why the hell does it take so long for us to implement the features? When we were shipping the original Xbox title, blah, it had wind, it had trees, it had snow, it had whatever. What's your problem? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, it was gentler and more polite. But in the essence, what you can see from the afternoon alone, right, You take one axis and then you multiply it across the gamut of the rest of the features, and boy, does the complexity creep up. And yes, you can spend a year or however long on wind or water or God rays or etc. alone, and it's actually really, really healthy to see how to do this end to end and how to make it usable by the people who will make it beautiful. Because in the end, all of our fancy algorithms, and this is a controversial statement I've kind of thrown around before, none of the graphics technology is worth a dime unless artists can make it beautiful. And in the end, that's what hopefully you saw in the afternoon session. So, very boring black slide to support that bombastic statement. Anyway, thank you. And speakers will be around for questions as usual.